The fringes of the fleet. In Lowestoft a boat was laid. Mark well what I do say. And she was built for the herring trade. But she has gone Erevan, Erevan, Erevan. The Lord knows where. They gave her government coal to burn. And a QF gun at bow and stern. And sent her out Erevan, etc. Her skipper was mate of a bucko ship, which always killed one man per trip. So he is used to Rovin, etc. Her mate was skipper of a chapel in Wales. And so he fights in topper and tails. Religious though Rovin, etc. Her engineer is 58. So he's prepared to meet his fate. Which ain't unlikely, Rovin, etc. Her leading stoker's 17. So he don't know what the judgments mean. Unless he cops Rovin, etc. Her cook was chef in the Lost Dog's home. Mark well what I do say. And I am sorry for Fritz when they all come. Erevan, Erevan, Arorin, and Erevan. Round the North Sea Rovin. The Lord knows where. The auxiliaries. And I? The Navy is very old and very wise. Much of her wisdom is on record and available for reference. But more of it works in the unconscious blood of those who serve her. She has 1,000 years of experience and can find precedent or parallel for any situation that the force of the weather or the malice of the king's enemies may bring about. The main principles of sea warfare hold good throughout all ages, and so far as the Navy has been allowed to put out her strength, these principles have been applied over all the seas of the world. For matters of detail, the Navy, to whom all days are alike, has simply returned to the practice and resurrected the spirit of old days. The oldest Navy. It was a brutal age ministered to by hard-fisted men, and we had put it 100 decent years behind us. When it all comes back again today, there are no prisons 7 for the crews of merchantmen, but they can go to the bottom by mine and torpedo even more quickly than their ancestors were run into Le Havre. The submarine takes the place of the privateer. The line, as in the old wars, is occupied bombarding and blockading elsewhere. But the seaborne traffic must continue, and that is being looked after by the lineal descendants of the crews of the long-extinct cutters and sloops and gunbrigs. The hour struck, and they reappeared to the tune of 50,000 odd men, in more than 2,000 ships, of which I have seen a few hundred words of command, may have changed a little. The tools are certainly more complex. But the spirit of the new crews who come to the old job is utterly unchanged. It is the same fierce, hard-living, heavy-handed, very cunning service, out of which the Navy as we know it today was born. It is called indifferently the trawler and auxiliary fleet. It is chiefly composed of fishermen. But it takes in everyone who may have maritime tastes, from retired admirals to the sons of the sea cook. It exists for the benefit of the traffic. And the annoyance of the enemy, its doings are recorded by flags stuck into charts. Its casualties are buried in obscure corners of the newspapers. The Grand Fleet knows it slightly. The restless light cruisers who chaperone it from the background are more intimate. The destroyers working off unlighted coasts over unmarked shoals come, as you might say, in direct contact with it. The submarine alternately praises Anne, since one periscope is very like Anna Thurkers's its activities. But the steady procession of traffic in home waters, liner and tramp 6, every 60 minutes blesses it altogether. Since this most Christian war includes laying mines in the fairways of traffic, and since these mines may be laid at any time by German submarines, especially built for the work, or by neutral ships, all fairways must be swept continuously day and night. When a nest of mines is reported, traffic must be hung up or deviated till it is cleared out. When traffic comes up channel, it 9 must be examined for contraband and other things, and the examining tugs lie out in a blaze of lights to remind ships of this. Months ago, when the war was young, the tugs did not know what to look for. Specially now they do all this mine searching and reporting and sweeping, plus the direction and examination of the traffic, plus the laying of our own ever-shifting minefields, is part of the trawler fleet's work, because the Naviaswiknuit is busy elsewhere, and there is always the enemy submarine with a price on her head, whom the trawler fleet hunts and traps with zeal and joy. Add to this that there are boats fishing for real fish to be protected in their work at sea, or chased off dangerous areas whither, because they are strictly forbidden to go, they naturally repair, and you will begin to get some idea of what the trawler and auxiliary fleet does. The ships and the men. Now imagine the acreage of several dock basins crammed gunwale to gunwale 10, with brown and umber and ochre, and rusted steam trawlers tugs harbor boats, and yachts once clean and respectable, now dirty and happy throw in fish steamers surprise packets of unknown lines and indescribable junks, sampans, lorches, catamarans, and general service stink pontoons filled with indescribable apparatus manned by men, no dozen of whom seem to talk the same dialect or wear the same clothes. The mustard-colored jersey, who is cleaning a six-pounder on a hull boat, clips his words between his teeth and would be happier in Gaelic, the whitish singlet and gray trousers held up by what is obviously his soldier brother's spare regimental belt, is pure Lowestoft. The complete bluser jean suit passing a wire down a hatch is Glasgow as far as you can hear him, which is a fair distance, because he wants something done too. The other end of the wire and the flat-faced boy, who should be attending to it, hails from the remoter Hebrides, and is looking at a girl on the dock edge. The bow-legged man in the ulster and 11 green-worsted comforter is a warm Grimsby skipper worth several thousands. He and his crew, who are mostly his own relations, keep themselves to themselves and save their money. The pirate with the red beard, barking over the rail at a friend with gold earrings, comes from Skye. The friend is West Country. The noticeably insignificant man with the soft and deprecating eye is skipper and partner of the big slashing Iceland trawler, on which he droops like a flower. She is built to almost Western Ocean lines, carries a little boat deck aft with tremendous stanchions, has a nose cocked high against ice and sweeping seas, and resembles a hawk moth at rest. The small, sniffing man is reported to be a holy terror at sea. Hunters and fishers. The child in the Pullman car uniform, just going ashore, is a wireless operator aged 19. He is attached to a flagship at least 120 feet long, under an admiral aged 25, who was till the other day 12th third mate of a North Atlantic tramp, but who now leads a squadron of 6 trawlers to hunt submarines. The principle is simple enough. Its application depends on circumstances and surroundings. One class of German submarines, meant for murder off the coasts, may use a winding and rabbit-like track between shoals where the choice of water is limited. Their career is rarely long, but while it lasts moderately exciting, others told off for deep-sea assassinations are attended to quite quietly, and without any excitement at all. Others again work the inside of the North Sea, making no distinction between neutrals and allied ships. These carry guns, and since their work keeps them a good deal on the surface, the trawler fleet, as we know, engages them, their submarine firing, sinking, and rising again in unexpected quarters. The trawler firing, dodging, and trying to ram. The trawlers are strongly built and can stand a great deal of punishment. Yet again, other German submarines hang about the skirts of fishing fleets and fire into the 13 brown of them. When the war was young, this gave splendidly frightful results. But for some reason or other, the game is not as popular as it used to be. Lastly, there are German submarines who perish by ways so curious and inexplicable that one could almost credit the whispered idea, it must come from the Scotch skippers, that the ghosts of the women they drowned pilot them to destruction. But what form these shadows take, whether of the Lusitania ladies or humbler stewardesses and hospital nurse, and what lights or sounds the thing fancies it sees or hears before it is blotted out, no man will ever know. The main fact is that the work is being done, whether it was necessary or politic to reawaken by violence every sporting instinct of a seagoing people, is a question which the enemy may have to consider later on. Dawn off the foreland, young flood making. Jumbled and short and steep. Black in the hollows and bright where it's breaking. Awkward water to sweep. Mines reported in the fairway. Warn all traffic and detain. Send up Unity, Clarable, Assyrian, Stormcock, and Golden Gain. Noon off the foreland, first ebb making. Lumpy and strong in the bite. Boom after boom and the golf hut shaking. And the jackdaws wild with fright. Mines located in the fairway. Boats now working up the chain. Sweepers, Unity, Clarable, Assyrian, Stormcock, and Golden Gain. Dusk off the foreland, last light going. And the traffic crowding through. And 5 damned trawlers with their sirens blowing. Heading the whole review. Sweep completed in the fairway. No more mines remain. Sent back, Unity, Clarable, Assyrian, Stormcock, and Golden Gain. The auxiliaries. Roman 2. The trawlers seem to look on mines as more or less fair play, but with the torpedo, it is otherwise. A Yarmouth man lay on his hatch, his gear neatly stowed away below, and told me that another Yarmouth boat had gone up with all hands, except one. 'Twas a submarine, not a mine, said he. They never gave our boys no chance. Now she was a Yarmouth boat we knew. All they never gave the boys no chance he was a submarine hunter. And he illustrated by means of matches placed at various angles how the blindfold business is conducted. And then he ended there's always what hell do you've got to think that out for 18 yourself while you're a working above him same, as if 'twas fish I should not care to be hunted for the life in shallow waters by a man who knows every bank and pothole of them, even if I had not killed his friends the week. Before being nearly all fishermen, they discuss their work in terms of fish, and put in their leisure fishing overside, when they sometimes pull up ghastly souvenirs. But they all want guns, those who have three-pounders clamor for sixes for 12s, and the 12-a-pound aristocracy dream of 4-inchers on anti-aircraft mountings, for the benefit of roving zeppelins. They will all get them in time. And I fancy it will be long ere they give them up. One West Country mate announced that a gun is a handy thing to have aboard always. But in peacetime I said wouldn't it be in the way? Wem used to now was the smiling answer never go to sea again. Without a gun I wouldn't if I had my way it keeps all hands pleased like a common sweeper. My sponsor and chaperone in this Elizabethan world of 18th century, seaman, was an ob who had gone down in the Landrill, assisted at the Heligoland fight scene the Blucher sink, and the bombs dropped on our boats when we tried to save the drowning whereby, as he said those Germans died Gottstrafen, 20 their own country, because we didn't wait to be strafed and has now found more peaceful days in an office ashore. He led me across many decks from craft to study the various appliances that they specialize in. Almost our last was what a North Country trawler called a common sweeper, that is to say a minesweeper. She was at tea in her shirt sleeves, and she protested loudly that there was nothing in sweeping. See that wire rope, she said, well, it leads through that lead to the ship which you're a sweepin' with. She makes her end fast, and you make yourn, then you sweep together, at whichever depth you've agreed upon between you by means of that arrangement there which regulates the depth. They give you a glass sort o' thing for keepin' your distance from the other ship, but that's not wanted if you know each other well. Then you sweep, as the sayin' is, there's nothin' in it. You sweep till this wire rope fouls the bloomin' mines. Then you go on till they appear on the surface, so to say, and then 21 you explodes them by means of shootin' at 'em with that rifle in the galley. There's nothin' in sweepin' more than that. And if you hit a mine, I asked, you go up, but you hadn't ought to hit 'em if you're a careful. The thing is to get hold of the first mine all right, and then you go on to the next, and so on in a way o' speakin'. And you can fish two tween times, said a voice from the next boat. A man leaned over and returned a borrowed mug. They talked about fishing, notably, that once they caught some red mullet which the common sweeper and his neighbor both agreed was not natural in those waters. As for mere sweeping, it bored them profoundly to talk about it. I only learned later, as part of the natural history of mines, that if you rake the trinitrotoluol by hand out of a German mine, you develop eruptions and skin poisoning. But on the authority of two experts, there is nothing in sweeping, nothing whatever. A block in the traffic. Now imagine not a pistol shot from these crowded quays, a little office hung round with charts that are penciled and noted over various shoals and soundings. There is a movable list of the boats at work, with quaint and domestic names outside the window. Lies the packed harbor outside, that again the line of traffic up, and down a stately cinemashow of 6 ships to the hour for the moment. The film sticks a boat, probably a common sweeper, reports an obstruction in a traffic lane a few miles away. She has found and exploded one mine. The office heard the dull boom of it before the wireless report came in all likelihood. There is a nest of them there. It is possible that a submarine may have gotten last night between certain shoals and laid them out. The shoals are being shepherded in case she is hidden anywhere. But the boundaries of the newly discovered Mineria must be fixed, and the traffic deviated. There is a 23 tramp outside with tugs and attendants. She has hit something and is leaking badly. Where shall she go? The office gives her her destination. The harbor is too full for her to settle down here. She swings off between the faithful tugs down coast. Someone asks by wireless if they shall hold up their traffic. It is exactly like a signaller offering a train to the next block. Yes, the office replies, wait a while. If it's what we think, there will be a little delay. If it isn't what we think, there will be a little longer delay. Meantime, sweepers are nosing round the suspected area looking for cuckoo's eggs, as a voice suggests, and a patrol boat lathers her way down coast to catch and stop anything that may be on the move. For skippers, our sometimes rather careless words begin to drop out of the air into the Charthung office. 6.5 cables south, 15 east of something or other. Mark it well, and tell them to work up from there. Is the order. Another mine exploded, yes. And we heard that too, says the office. What about the submarine? Elizabeth Huggins reports. Elizabeth's scandal must be fairly high-flavored for a torpedo boat of immoral aspect. Slings herself out of harbor and hastens to share it if Elizabeth has not spoken the truth. There may be words between the parties, for the present. A penciled suggestion seems to cover the case together, with a demand, as far as one can make out, for more common sweepers. They will be forthcoming. Very shortly those at work have got the run of the mines now, and are busily howking them up. A trawler skipper wishes to speak to the office. They have ordered him out, but his boiler, most of it, is on the quay at the present time. And yell, remember, it's the same why my foremast and port rigging, sir. The office does not precisely remember. But if boiler and foremast are on the quay, the rest of the ship had better stay alongside. The skipper falls away relieved. He scraped a tramp a few nights ago, in a bit of a sea. There is a little mutter of 25 gunfire somewhere across the grey water, where a fleet is at work. A monitor as broad as she is long comes back from wherever the trouble is, slips through the harbor mouth, all wreathed with signals, is received by two motherly lighters, and to all appearance goes to sleep between them. The office does not even look up, for that is not in their department. They have found a trawler to replace the boilerless one. Her name is slid into the rack. The immoral torpedo boat flounces back to her moorings. Evidently what Elizabeth Huggins said was not evidence. The messages and replies begin again as the day closes. The night patrol returned now to the inner harbor at twilight. There was a stir among the packed craft, like the separation of dried tea leaves. In water, the swing bridge across the basin shut against us. A boat shot out of the jam, took the narrow exit at a fair 7 knots, and rounded in the outer 26 harbor with all the pomp of a flagship, which was exactly what she was. Others followed, breaking away from every quarter in silence. Boat after boat fell into languor, stowed away spars and buoys in order on their clean decks. Guns cast loose and ready, wheelhouse windows darkened, and everything in order for a day or a week or a month out. There was no word anywhere. The interrupted foot traffic stared at them as they slid past below. A woman beside me waved her hand to a man on one of them, and I saw his face light as he waved back the boat where they had demonstrated for me with matches. Was the last her skipper hadn't thought it worth while to tell me that he was going that evening. Then the line straightened up and stood out to sea. You never said this was going to happen, I said reproachfully to my ob. No more I did, said he. It's the night patrol going out. Fact is, I am so used to the bloomin' evolution that it never struck me to mention it, as you might say. Farewell and adieu to you Greenwich ladies. Farewell and adieu to you ladies ashore. For we've received orders to work to the eastward, where we hope in a short time to strafe 'em some more. Well duck and well dive like little tin turtles. Well duck and well dive underneath the North Seas, until we strike something that doesn't expect us. From here to Cuxhaven it's go as you please. The first thing we did was to dock in a minefield, which isn't a place where repairs should be done. And there we lay doggo in 12 fathom water, with trinitrotoluol hogging our run. The next thing we did, we rose under a zeppelin, with his shiny big belly half blocking the sky. But what in the heavens can you do with 6-pounders? So we fired what we had, and we bade him goodbye. Submarines. And the chief business of the trawler fleet is to attend to the traffic. The submarine in her sphere attends to the enemy like the destroyer. The submarine has created its own type of officer and man with language and traditions apart from the rest of the service. And yet at heart unchangingly of the service, their business is to run monstrous risks from earth, air, and water, in what to be of any use must be the coldest of cold blood. The commander's is more a one-man job, as the crew's is more teamwork than any other employment afloat. That is why the relations between submarine officers and men are what they are. They play 32 hourly for each other's lives with death, the umpire always at their elbow on tiptoe to give them out. There is a stretch of water once dear to amateur yachtsmen, now given over to scouts, submarines, destroyers, and of course contingents of trawlers. We were waiting the return of some boats, which were due to report. A couple surged up the still harbor in the afternoon light, and tied up beside their sisters, there climbed out of them 3 or 4 high-booted sunken pirates clad in sweaters under jackets that a stoker of the last generation would have disowned. This was their first chance to compare notes at close hand together. They lamented the loss of a Zeppelina perfect mug of a Zepp who had come down very low, and offered one of them a sitting shot. But what can you do with our guns? I gave him what I had, and then he started bombing. I know he did. Another said, I heard him. That's what brought me down to you. I thought he had you that last time. My steering gear jammed just after I went down, and I had to go round in circles till I got it straightened out, but wast he a mug? Was he the brute with the patch on his port side? A sister boat demanded. No, this fellow had just been hatched, he was almost sitting on the water heaving bombs over. And my blasted steering gear went, and chose then to go wrong, the other commander mourned. I thought his last little egg was going to get me. Half an hour later I was formally introduced to 3 or 4 quite strange, quite immaculate officers, freshly shaved, and a little tired about the eyes, whom I thought I had met before. Labor and refreshment. Meantime it was on the hour of evening drinks. One of the boats was still unaccounted 34, for no one talked of her. They rather discussed motor cars and Admiralty constructors' beauty. Felt like that queer twilight watch at the front when the homing aeroplanes drop in presently. A signaller entered V42. Outside, sir wants to know which channel she shall use. Oh, thank you, tell her to take so-and-so, mine, remember. Was vermouth and bitters, and later, on V42, himself found a soft chair and joined the committee of instruction. Those next for duty, as well as those in training, wished to hear what was going on, and who had shifted what to wear, and how certain arrangements had worked. They were told in language, not to be found in any printable book. Questions and answers were alike Hebrew to one listener, but he gathered that every boat carried a second in command, a strong, persevering youth, who seemed responsible for everything that went wrong, from a motor cylinder to a torpedo. Then somebody touched on the mercantile marine and its habits. Said one philosopher, they can't be 35 expected to take any more risks than they do. I wouldn't, if I was a skipper. I'd loose off at any blessed periscope I saw. That's all very fine, you wait till you've had a patriotic tramp trying to strafe you at your own back door, said another. Someone told a tale of a man with a voice notable even in a service where men are not trained to whisper. He was coming back, empty-handed, dirty, tired, and best left alone, from the peace of the German side. He had entered our hectic home waters, where the usual tramp shelled, and by miraculous luck crumpled his periscope. Another man might have dived, but Bonerges kept on rising, majestic and wrathful. He rose personally through his main hatch, and at 2,000 yards, have I said it was a still day, addressed the tramp, even at that distance. She gathered it was a naval officer with a grievance, and by the time he ran alongside, she was in a state of coma, but managed to stammer, well, sir, at least y'all admit that our shooting was pretty good. All those tramps ought to be disarmed, and we ought to have all their guns, said a voice out of a corner. What, still worrying over your mug? Someone replied. He was a mug, went on the man of one idea. If it had a couple of 12s, even I could have strafed him proper. I don't know whether I shall mutiny or desert, or write to the first sea lord about it. Strafe all Admiralty constructors to begin with. I could build a better boat with a 4-inch lathe and a sardine tin than the speaker named her by letter and number. That's pure jealousy, her commander explained to the company. Ever since I installed a hemi patent electric wash basin, he's been intriguing to get her. Why, 37 we know, he doesn't wash, he'd only use the basin to keep beer in. Underwater works. However often one meets it, as in this war one meets it at every turn, one never gets used to the holy spirit of man at his job, the common sweeper growling over his mug of tea that there was nothing in sweepin', and these idly chaffing men, new-shaved and attired from the gates of death which had let them through for the 50th time, were all of the same fabric, incomprehensible, I should imagine, to the enemy, and the stuff held good throughout all the world, from the Dardanelles to the Baltic, where only a little while ago another batch of submarines had slipped in and begun to be busy. I had spent some of the afternoon in looking through reports of submarine work in the Sea of Marmora. They read like the diary of energetic weasels in an overcrowded chicken run. And the results for each boat were tabulated 38, something like a cricket score. There were no maiden overs. One came across jewels of price, set in the flat. Official phraseology, for example, one man who was describing some steps he was taking to remedy certain defects, interjected casually. At this point, I had to go under for a little, as a man in a boat was trying to grab my periscope with his hand, no reference before or after to the said man, or his fate again came. Across a dhow with a Turkish skipper, he seemed so miserable that I let him go, and elsewhere in those waters, a submarine overhauled a steamer full of Turkish passengers, some of whom, arguing on their allies' lines, promptly leaped overboard our boat, fished them out, and returned them, for she was not killing civilians. In another affair, which included several ships now at the bottom and one submarine, the commander relaxes enough to note that the men behaved very well under direct and flanking fire from rifles at about 15 yards, This was not, I believe, the submarine that fought the Turkish cavalry on 39, the beach, and in addition to matters much more marvelous than any I have hinted at the reports deal, with repairs and shifts and contrivances carried through, in the face of dangers that read like the last delirium of romance. One boat went down the straits, and found herself rather canted over to one side. A mine and chain had jammed under her forward devinkling. So far as I made out, she shook it off by standing on her head and jerking backwards, or it may have been for the thing has occurred more than once. She merely rose as much as she could when she could, and then released it by hand as the official phrase goes. Four nightmares, and who a few months ago could have invented, or having invented, would have dared to print such a nightmare as this? There was a boat in the North Sea who ran into a net, and was caught by the nose. She rose still entangled, meaning to cut the thing away on the surface, but a Zeppelin 40 in waiting saw and bombed her, and she had to go down again. At once, but not too wildly, or she would get herself more wrapped up than ever she went down, and by slow working and weaving and wriggling, guided only by guesses at the meaning of each scrape and grind of the net on her blind forehead at last. She drew clear, then she sat on the bottom, and thought the question was whether she should go back at once and warn her confederates against the trap, or wait till the destroyers, which she knew the Zeppelin would have signaled for, should come out to finish her still entangled, as they would suppose in the net. It was a simple calculation of comparative speeds and positions, and when it was worked out, she decided to try for the double event. Within a few minutes of the time she had allowed for them, she heard the twitter of four destroyers' screws, quartering above her rose, got her shot in, saw one destroyer crumple, hung round, till another took the wreck in tow, said goodbye to the spare brace. She was 41 at the end of her supplies, and reached the rendezvous in time to turn her friends. And since we are dealing in nightmares, here are two Maron genuine, the other mercifully false. There was a boat, not only at, but in the mouth of a riverwell home in German territory. She was spotted, and went under her commander, perfectly aware that there was not more than 5 feet of water over her conjuncture, so that even a torpedo boat, let alone a destroyer, would hit it if she came over, but nothing hit anything. The search was conducted on scientific principles, while they sat on the silt and suffered. Then the commander heard the rasp of a wire trawl sweeping over his hull. It was not a nice sound, but there happened to be a couple of gramophones aboard, and he turned them both on to drown it, and in due time that boat got home with everybody's hair of just the same color as when they had started. The other nightmare arose out of silence and imagination. A boat had gone to bed 42 on the bottom, in a spot where she might reasonably expect to be looked for, but it was a convenient jumping off, or up place for the work in hand, about the bad hour of 2 A Roman 1000. The commander was waked by one of his men, who whispered to him, "They've got the chains on us, sir," whether it was pure nightmare and hallucination of long wakefulness, something relaxing and releasing in that packed box of machinery, or the disgustful reality. The commander could not tell, but it had all the makings of panic in it, so the lord and long training put it into his head to reply, "Have they? Well, we shan't be coming up till 9 o'clock this morning. Well, see about it, then turn out that light, please." He did not sleep, but the dreamer and the others did, and when morning came, and he gave the order to rise, and she rose unhampered, and he saw the gray smeared seas from above once again, he said it was a very refreshing sight. Lastly, which is on all fours with the 43 gamble of the chase, a man was coming home, rather bored after an uneventful trip. It was necessary for him to sit on the bottom for a while, and there he played patience. Of a sudden it struck him as a vow, and an omen, that if he worked out the next game correctly he would go up and strafe something. The cards fell all in order. He went up at once, and found himself alongside a German, whom, as he had promised and prophesied to himself, he destroyed. She was a mine layer, and needed only a jar to dissipate like a cracked electric light bulb. He was somewhat impressed by the contrast between the single-handed game, 50 feet below the ascent, the attack, the amazing result, and when he descended again his cards just as he had left them. The ships destroy us above, and ensnare us beneath. We arise, we lie down, and we move. In the belly of death, the ships have 1,000 eyes to mark where we come, and the mirth of a seaport dies when our blow gets home. Submarines. Roman 2. I was honored by a glimpse into this veiled life. In a boat which was merely practicing between trips, submarines are like cats, they never tell who they were with last night. And they sleep as much as they can. If you board a submarine off duty, you generally see a perspective of foreshortened, fattish men, laid all along. The men say that, except at certain times, It is rather an easy life with relaxed regulations about smoking, calculated to make a man put on flesh. One requires well-petted nerves. Many of the men do not appear on deck throughout the whole trip. After all, why should they if they don't want to? They know that they are responsible in their 48 department for their comrades' lives, as their comrades are responsible for theirs. What's the use of flapping about better lay in some magazines and cigarettes? When we set forth, there had been some trouble in the fairway, and a mind neutral, whose misfortune all bore with exemplary calm, was careened on a nearby shoal. Suppose there are more minds knocking about, I suggested. Well, hope they're errant, was the soothing reply. Minds are all joss, you either hit 'em or you don't. And if you do, they don't always go off, they scrape alongside. What's the etiquette then? Shut off both propellers and hope. We were dodging various craft down the harbor when a squadron of trawlers came out on our beam at that extravagant rate of speed, which unlimited government coal always leads to. They were led by an ugly, upstanding, black-sided buccaneer with 12-pounders. Ah, that's the king of the trawlers, 49, isn't he? Carrying dog too? Give him room, one said. We were all in the narrowed harbor mouth together. There's my youngest daughter, take a look at her, someone hummed, as a punctilious navy cap slid by on a very near bridge. Well, fall in behind him, they're going over to the neutral. Then they'll sweep. By the by, did you hear about one of the passengers in the neutral yesterday? He was taken off of course by a destroyer, and the only thing he said was 25 time I ave insured, but not this time, ang it. The trawlers lunged ahead toward the forlorn neutral. Our destroyer nipped past us with that high-shouldered terrier-like pouncing action of the newer boats, and went ahead a tramp in ballast. Her propeller, half out of water, threshed along through the sallow haze. Lord, what a shot, somebody said enviously. The men on the little deck 50 looked across at the slow-moving silhouette. One of them, a cigarette behind his ear, smiled at a companion. Then we went down not as they go when they are pressed. The record, I believe, is 50 feet in 50 seconds from top to bottom, but genteelly, to an orchestra of appropriate sounds, roarings and blowings, and after the orders which come from the commander alone, utter silence and peace. There's the bottom, we bumped at 50-52, he said. I didn't feel it. Well, try again, watch the gauge and y'all see it flick a little. The practice of the art. It may have been so, but I was more interested in the faces, and above all the eyes all down the length of her. It was to them, of course, the simplest of maneuvers. They dropped into gear, as no machine could, but the training of years and the experience of the year leaped up behind those steady 51 eyes under the electrics in the shadow of the tall motors between the pipes and the curved hull, or glued to their special gauges. One forgot the body's alto. There but one will never forget the eyes, or the ennobled faces. One man I remember in particular on deck. His was no more than a grave, rather striking countenance cast in the unmistakable petty officer's mold below. As I saw him in profile handling a vital control, he looked like the Doge of Venice, the prior of some sternly ruled monastic order, an old-time pope, anything that signifies trained and stored intellectual power, utterly and ascetically devoted to some vast impersonal end. And so, with a much younger man who changed into such a monk as Frank Dixie, used to draw only a couple of torpedomen, not being in gear for the moment, read an illustrated paper. Their time did not come till we went up and got to business, which meant firing at our destroyer, and I think keeping out of the light of a friend's torpedoes. The attack and everything connected with 52, it is solely the commander's affair. He is the only one who gets any fun at all, since he is the eye, the brain, and the hand of the whole. Thigh's single figure at the periscope. The second in command heaves sighs and prays that the dummy torpedo, there is less trouble about the live ones, will go off all right, or hell be told about it. The others wait and follow the quick run of orders. It is, if not a convention, a fairly established custom, that the commander shall inferentially give his world some idea of what is going on. At least, I only heard of one man who says nothing whatever, and doesn't even wriggle his shoulders. When he is on the sight, the others soliloquize, etc., according to their temperament, and the periscope is as revealing as golf. Submarines nowadays are expected to look out for themselves more than at the old practices. When the destroyers walked circumspectly, we dived and circulated underwater for a while, and then rose for a sight something like this, up a little, up still, where the deuce has he 53 got to a half a dozen orders as to helm and depth of descent. and a pause broken by a drumming noise somewhere above which increases and passes away. That's better up again. This refers to the periscope. Yes, I know we don't think all right, keep her down, damn it, that ought to be 19 knots, dirty trick, he's changing speed, no. He's all right, ready forward there, a valve sputters, and drips the torpedomen crouch over their tubes, and nod to themselves. Their faces have changed now, he hast spotted us, yet well juiced more helm and depth orders, but specially helm wish, we were working a beam tube near mind up a last string of order 600, and he doesn't see us fire. The dummy left the second in command, cocked one ear, and looked relieved up. We rose, the wet air and spray spattered through the hatch, the destroyer swung off to retrieve the dummy. Careless brutes destroyers are, said 154 officer, that fellow nearly walked over us just now, did you notice? The commander was playing his game out over Agon stroke by stroke, with a beam tube id, ha strafed him amidships, he concluded. Why didn't you then, I asked. There were loads of shiny reasons, which reminded me that we were at war and cleared for action, and that the interlude had been merely play. A companion rose alongside and wanted to know whether we had seen anything of her dummy. No, but we heard, it was the short answer. I was rather annoyed because I had seen that particular daughter of destruction on the stocks only a short time ago, and here she was grown up and talking about her missing children. In the harbor again, one found more submarines, all patterns and makes and sizes, with rumors of yet more and larger, to follow. Naturally their men say that we are only at the beginning of the submarine 55. We shall have them presently for all purposes. The man and the work. Now here is a mystery of the service. A man gets a boat which for 2 years becomes his very self. His morning hope, his evening dream. His joy throughout the day. With him is a second in command, an engineer, and some others. They prove each other's souls habitually, every few days by the direct test of peril, till they act, think, and endure as a unit in. And with the boat that commander is transferred to another boat he tries to take with him, if he can, which he can't, as many of his other selves as possible. He is pitched into a new type, twice the size of the old one, with 3 times as many gadgets and unexplored temperament and unknown leanings. After his first trip, he comes back clamoring for the head of her constructor of his own second, in command his engineer, his Cox, and a few 56 other ratings. They for their part wish him dead on the beach, because last commission with so-and-so, nothing ever went wrong. Anywhere a fortnight later you can remind the commander of what he said, and he will deny every word of it. She's not, he says, so very vile things, considered barring her 5-ton, torpedodorix, the abominations of her wireless, and the tropical temperature of her beer lockers, all of which signifies that the new boat has found her soul, and her commander would not change her for battle cruisers. Therefore, that he may remember he is the service, and not a branch of it, he is, after certain seasons, shifted to a battle cruiser, where he lives in a blaze of admirals, and aiguillettes responsible for vast decks and crypt-like flats, a student of extended above-water tactics, thinking in tens of thousands of yards, instead of his modest but deadly 3 to 1200. And the man who takes his place straightway forgets that he ever looked down on great rollers from a 60-foot bridge under the whole breadth of heaven, but crawls, and 57 climbs and dives, through conjunctures with those same waves wet in his neck. And when the cruisers pass him tearing the deep open in half a gale, thanks God he is not as they are, and goes to bed beneath their distracted keels. Expert opinions. But submarine work is cold-blooded business. This was at a little session in a green-curtained wardroom, cum owner's cabin. Then there's no truth in the yarn that you can feel when the torpedo's going to get home, I asked. Not a word. You sometimes see it get home or miss. As the case may be, of course, it's never your fault if it misses, it's all your second in command. That's true too, said the second. I catch it all round, that's what I am here for. And what about the third man? There was one aboard at the time. He generally comes from a smaller 58 boat to pick up real work if he can suppress his intellect and doesn't talk last commission. The third hand promptly denied the possession of any intellect and was quite dumb about his last boat. And the men, they train on two, they train each other. Yes, one gets to know about as well as they get to know us up topside. A man can take himself in for months for half a commission. P-raps down below. He can't. It's all in cold blood, not like at the front, where they have something exciting all the time. Then bumping minds isn't exciting. Not one little bit. You can't bump back at him, even with a Zepp. Oh, now and then one interrupted, and they laughed as they explained. Yes, that was rather funny. One of our boats came up slap underneath. A low Zepp looked for the sky, and couldn't see anything, except this fat shining belly, almost on top of him. Luckily 59, it wasn't the Zepp's stingin' end, so our boat went to windward and kept just awash. There was a bit of a sea, and the Zepp had to work against the wind. They don't like that our boat sent a man to the gun. He was pretty well drowned, of course. But he hung on choking and spitting and held his breath, and got in shots where he could. This Zepp was strafing bombs about for all she was worth. And who was it? McCartney? I think, potting at her between dives, and naturally, all hands wanted to look at the performance. So about half the North Sea flopped down below Ando. They had a Charlie Chaplin time of it. Well, somehow McCartney managed to rip the Zepp a bit, and she went to leeward with a list on her. We saw her a fortnight later with a patch on her port side. Oh, if Fritz only fought clean, this wouldn't be half a bad show, but Fritz can't fight clean. And we can't do what he do 7, if we were allowed to, one said. No, we can't, tisn't done. We have to fish Fritz out of the water, dry him, and 60, give him cocktails, and send him to Donington Hall. And what does Fritz do? I asked. He sputters and clicks and bows. He has all the correct motions, but of course, when he's your prisoner, you can't tell him what he really is. And do you suppose Fritz understands any of it? I went on. No, or he wouldn't have Lusitania'd. This war was his first chance of making his name, and he chucked it all away for the sake of showing off as a foul Gottstrafer. And they talked of that hour of the night when submarines come to the top like mermaids to get and give information of boats, whose business it is to fire as much and to splash about as aggressively as possible, and of other boats, who avoid any sort of displayed on boats watching and relieving watch with their periscope, just showing like a crocodile's eye at the back of islands, and the mouths of channels where something may some day move out in procession to its doom. Be well assured that on our side, our challenged oceans fight, though headlong wind and heaping tide make us their sport tonight. Through force of weather, not of war, in jeopardy we steer. Then welcome fate's discourtesy, whereby it shall appear how in all time of our distress, as in our triumph too, the game is more than the player of the game, and the ship is more than the crew. Be well assured, though wave and wind have mightier blows in store, that we who keep the watch assigned must stand to it the more. And as our streaming bows dismiss each billow's balked career, sing welcome fate's discourtesy, whereby it is made clear how in all time of our distress, as in our triumph too, the game is more than the player of the game, and the ship is more than the crew. Be well assured, though in our power is nothing left to give, but time and place to meet the hour, and leave to strive to live, till these dissolve our order holds. Our service binds us here. Then welcome fate's discourtesy, whereby it is made clear how in all time of our distress, and our deliverance too, the game is more than the player of the game, and the ship is more than the crew. Patrols. And on the edge of the North Sea sits an admiral in charge of a stretch of coast without lights or marks, along which the traffic moves much as usual in front of him. There is nothing but the east wind, the enemy, and some few are ships behind him. There are towns with Roman 1000 PS attached who a little while ago didn't see the reason for certain lighting orders. When a zeppelin or two came, they saw left and right of him are enormous docks with vast crowded sheds, miles of stone-faced quayages, loaded with all manner of supplies, and crowded with mixed shipping. In this exalted world, one met staff captains, staff commanders, 64 staff lieutenants and secretaries with paymasters so senior that they almost ranked with admirals. There were warrant officers too who long ago gave up splashing about decks barefoot, and now check and issue stores to the ravenous, untruthful fleet, said one of these, guarding a collection of desirable things to a cross between a sick bay attendant and a junior writer. But he was really an expert burglar, no? And you can tell Mr. So-and-so, with my compliments, that the storekeeper's gone away with the key of these stores in his pocket. Understand me, in his trousers pocket. He snorted at my next question. Do I know any destroyer lieutenants? Said he. This coast's rank with destroyer lieutenants are born stealing. It's a mercy they's too busy to practice forgery, or id be in jail. Engineer commanders, engineer lieutenants, there a worse look here if my own mother was to come to me beggin' brass screws for her own coffin. I did think twice before I'd 65. Oblige the old lady war's war, I grant you that. But what I've got to contend with is crime. I referred to him a case of conscience in which every one concerned acted exactly as he should, and it nearly ended in murder during a lengthy action. The working of a gun was hampered by some empty cartridge cases, which the lieutenant in charge made signs. No man could hear his neighbor speak. Just then should be hove overboard, upon which the gunner rushed forward and made other signs that they were on charge and must be tallied and accounted for. He too was trained in a strict school, upon which the lieutenant, but that he was busy, would have slain the gunner for refusing orders in action afterwards. He wanted him shot by court-martial, but everyone was voiceless by then, and could only mouth and croak at each other till somebody laughed, and the pedantic gunner was spared. Well, that's what you might fairly call a naval crux, said my friend among 66. The stores, the lieutenant was right, must refuse orders. In action the gunner was right, empty cases are on charge, no one ought to chuck him away that way. But damn it, they were all of 'em right, it ought to ha' been a marine. Then they could have killed him and preserved discipline at the same time. A little theory. The problem of this coast resolves itself into keeping touch with the enemy's movements in preparing matters to trap and hinder him when he moves, and in so entertaining him that he shall not have time to draw clear before a blow descends on him from another quarter. There are then three lines of defense, the outer, the inner, and the home waters, the traffic and fishing are always with us. The blackboard idea of it is always to have stronger forces more immediately available everywhere than those. The enemy can send X German submarines, draw 67 English destroyers. Then X calls XY to deal with, a who in turn calls up B, a scout, and possibly A2, with a fair chance that if XYZ, a Zeppelin carry-on, they will run into A2 B2 C cruisers. At this point, the equation generally stops. If it continued, it would end mathematically in the whole of the German fleet coming out. Then another factor, which we may call the Grand Fleet, would come from another place. To change the comparisons, the Grand Fleet is the strong left ready to give the knockout blow on the point of the chin when the head is thrown up. The other fleets and other arrangements threaten the enemy's solar plexus and stomach. Somewhere in relation to the Grand Fleet lies the blockading cordon, which examines neutral traffic. It could be drawn as tight as a Turkish bowstring, but for reasons which we may arrive at after the war, it does not seem to have been so drawn up to date. The enemy lies behind his mines, and ours raids our coasts when he sees a chance. 68, and kills seagoing civilians at sight or guess, with intent to terrify. Most sailormen are mixed up with a woman or two. A fair percentage of them have seen men drown. They can realize what it is when women go down choking in horrible tangles and heavings of draperies. To say that the enemy has cut himself from the fellowship of all who use the seas is rather understating the case. As a man observed thoughtfully, you can't look at any water now without seeing Lusitania sprawlin' all across it. And just think of those words, North German, Lloyd Hamburg, America, and such things in the time to come. They simply mustn't be. He was an elderly trawler, respectable as they make them, who after many years of fishing had discovered his real vocation. I never thought I'd like killin' men, he reflected, never seemed to be any o' my duty, but it isn't I do. A great deal of the East Coast work concerns minefielders, and the enemies, both of which shift as occasion, requires 69 we search for, and root out the enemy's mines. They do the like by us. It is a perpetual game of finding, springing, and laying traps on the least as well as the most likely runaways. That ships use such sea snaring and wiring, as the world never dreamt of. We are hampered in this, because our Navy respects neutrals, and spends a great deal of its time in making their path safe for them. The enemy does not, he blows them up because that cows and impresses them, and so adds to his prestige. Death and the destroyer. The easiest way of finding a minefield is to steam into it on the edge of night for choice, with a steep sea running, for that brings the bows down like a chopper on the detonator horns. Some boats have enjoyed this experience and still live. There was one destroyer, and there may have been others since, who came through 24 hours of highly compressed life. 70. She had an idea that there was a minefield somewhere about, and left her companions behind while she explored. The weather was dead calm, and she walked delicately. She saw one Scandinavian steamer blow up a couple of miles away, rescued the skipper, and some hands saw another neutral which she could not reach, till all was over, skied in another direction. And between her life-saving efforts and her natural curiosity, got herself as thoroughly mixed up with the field. As a camel among tent ropes, a destroyer's bows are very fine, and her sides are very straight. This causes her to cleave the wave with the minimum of disturbance. And this boat had no desire to cleave anything else. Nonetheless, from time to time, she heard a mine grate or tinkle or jar. I could not arrive at the precise note it strikes, but they say it is unpleasant on her plates. Sometimes she would be free of them for a long while, and began to hope she was clear. At other times they were numerous. But when at last she seemed to have worried out of the danger zone, 71, lieutenant and sub together, left the bridge for a cup of tea. In those days, we took mines very seriously, as they were in act to drink. They heard the hateful sound again. Just outside the wardroom, both put their cups down, with extreme care, little fingers extended. We felt as if they might blow up too, and tiptoed on deck, where they met the forecastle also on tiptoe. They pulled themselves together, and asked severely what the forecastle thought it was doing. Beg pardon, sir, but there's another of those blighters tap-tapping alongside our. And they all waited and listened to their common coffin being nailed by Death himself. But the things bumped away at this point. They thought it only decent to invite the rescued skipper, warm and blanketed in one of their bunks, to step up and do any further perishing in the open. No thank you, said he. Last time I was blown up in my bunk too. That was all right, so I think now too I stay in my bunk here. It is cold upstairs. Somehow or other they got out of the 72 mess. After all, yes, we used to take mines awfully seriously in those days. One comfort is Fritz'll take them seriously. When he comes out, Fritz don't like mines. Who does? I wanted to know. If you'd been here a little while ago, you'd seen a commander common in, with a big un slung under his counter. He brought the beastly thing in to analyze. The rest of his squadron followed at 2-knot intervals, and everything in harbor that had steam up scattered. The admirable commander. Presently I had the honor to meet a lieutenant commander admiral, who had retired from the service, but like others had turned out again at the first flash of the guns, and now Comanche, who had great ships erupting at his least signal, a squadron of trawlers, for the protection of the Doggerbank fleet at present. Priceless alone, the chance of the paying submarinemen, would fish in much warmer places. 73, his flagship was once a multi-millionaire's private yacht, in her mixture of stark, carpetless, curtainless, carbalized present, with voluptuously curved, broad-decked easy stairwayed. Past she might be Queen Guinevere in the convent at Amesbury, and her lieutenant commander, most careful to pay all due compliments to admirals who were midshipmen, when he was a commander, leads a congregation of very hard men. Indeed, they do precisely what he tells them to, and with him go through strange experiences because they love him, and because his language is volcanic and wonderful, what you might call papacat apocalyptic. I saw the old navy making ready to lead out the new under a gray sky, and a falling glass, wisdom and cunning of the old man, backed up by the passion and power of the younger breed, and the discipline which had been his soul for half a century binding them all. What'll he do this time? I asked of one who might know. Hell cruise between 2 and 374 east, but if y'all tell me what he want do it, be more to the point. He's mine hunting, I expect, just now. Wasted material. Here is a digression suggested by the sight of a man I had known, in other scenes, dispatch riding round a fleet in a petrolaunch. There are many of his type yachtsmen of sorts, accustomed to take chances, who do not hold master's certificates, and cannot be given seagoing commands like my friend. They do general utility, work often in their own boats. This is a waste of good material. Nobody wants amateur navigate or traffic lanes, are none too wide as it is, but these gentlemen ought to be distributed among the trawler fleet as strictly combatant officers. A trawler skipper may be an excellent seaman, but slow with a submarine shelling and diving, or in cutting out enemy trawlers. The young ones who can master QF gun work in a very short time would, though there might be friction, a court-martial or two, and probably losses at first pay, for their keep. Even 100 or so of amateurs, more or less controlled by their squadron commanders, would make a happy beginning, and I am sure they would all be extremely grateful. Where the east wind is brewed fresh and fresh every morning, and the balmy night breezes blow straight from the pole. I heard a destroyer sing, "What an enjoyable life does one lead on the North Sea patrol. To blow things to bits is our business and Fritz's." Which means there are minefields wherever you stroll. Unless you've particular wish to die quick, y'all avoid steering close to the North Sea patrol. We warn from disaster the mercantile master, who takes in high dudgeon our life-saving role. For everyone's grousing at docking and dowsing. The marks and the lights on the North Sea Patrol. 12 verses omitted. So swept but surviving, half drowned but still driving. I watched her head out through the swell off the shoal. And I heard her propellers roar right to poor fellers who run such a hell as the North Sea Patrol. Patrols. Roman 2. The Great Basins were crammed with craft of kinds never known before on any navy list. Some were as they were born, others had been converted, and a multitude have been designed for special cases. The Navy prepares against all contingencies by land, sea, and air. It was a relief to meet a batch of comprehensible destroyers, and to drop again into the little mousetrap wardrooms, which are as large-hearted as all our oceans. The men one used to know as destroyer lieutenants born stealing are serious commanders and captains today, but their sons, lieutenants in command and lieutenant commanders, do follow them. The sea in peace is a hard life. 80 war only sketches an extra line or two round the young mouths. The routine of ships always ready for action is so part of the blood now that no one notices anything except the absence of formality, and of the crimes of peace what warrant officers used to say at length is cut down to a grunt. What the sailorman did not know and expected to have told him does not exist. He has done it all too often at sea and ashore. I watched a little party working under a leading hand at a job which 18 months ago would have required a gunner in charge. It was comic to see his orders trying to overtake the execution of them. Ratings coming aboard carried themselves with a to me new swing, not swank, but consciousness of adequacy. The high dark forecastles, which thank goodness are only washed twice a week, received them and their bags, and they tornado on the instant as a man picks up his life at home. Like the submarine crew, they come to be a breed, a part double-jointed 81 extra-toed with brazen bowels and no sort of nerves. It is the same in the engineer room, when the ships come in for their regular looking over. Those who love them, which you would never guess from the language, know exactly what they need and get it without fuss. Everything that steams has her individual peculiarity, and the great thing is at overhaul to keep to it and not develop a new one if, for example, through some trick of her screws not synchronizing a destroyer, always casts to port when she goes astern. Do not let any zealous soul try to make her run true, or you will have to learn her helm all over again. And it is vital that you should know exactly what your ship is going to do 3 seconds before she does it. Similarly with men, if anyone from lieutenant commander to stoker changes his personal trick or habit in the manner in which he clutches his chin or caresses his nose at a crisis matter, must be carefully considered in this world, where 82 each is trustee for his neighbor's life, and vastly more important the corporate honor. What are the destroyers doing just now? I asked. Oh, running about much the same as usual. The Navy hasn't the least objection to telling one everything that it is doing. Unfortunately, it speaks its own language, which is incomprehensible to the civilian, but you will find it all in the Channel Pilot and the Riddle of the Sands. It is a foul coast, hairy with currents and rips, and mottled with shoals and rocks. Practically, the same men hold on here in the same ships, with much the same crews for months and months. A most senior officer told me that they were good boys. In reflection, quite good boys, but neither he nor the flags on his chart explained how they managed their lightless, unmarked navigations through black night, blinding rain, and the crazy rebounding North Sea gales. They themselves ascribe 83 it to Joss that they have not piled up their ships 100 times. I expect it must be because we're always dodging about over the same ground. One gets to smell it. We've bumped pretty hard, of course, but we haven't expended much up to date. You never know your luck on patrol, though. The nature of the beast. Personally, though they have been true friends to me, I loathe destroyers and all the raw, racking, ricocheting life that goes with them. Smell of the wet lammies and damp wardroom cushions, the galley chimney smoking out the bridge, the obstacle-strewn deck, and the pervading beastliness of oil, grit, and greasy iron. Even at moorings they shiver and sidle like half-backed horses at sea. They will neither rise up and fly clear like the hydroplanes, nor dive and be done with it like the submarines, but imitate the vices of both. A scientist of the lower deck 84 describes them as half switchback, half watershoot, and hell continuous. Their only merit from a landsman's point of view is that they can crumple themselves up from stem to bridge, and I have seen it still get home, but one does not breathe these compliments to their commanders. Other destroyers may Bethy will point them out to you poisonous bags of tricks, but their own command never. Is she highbowed? That is the only type which overrides the seas instead of smothering. Is she low bows glide through the water where those collier-nosed brutes smash it open? Is she mucked up with submarine catchers They rather improve her trim, no other ship has them, have they been denied to her thank. Heaven we go to sea without a fish-curing plant on deck. Does she roll even for her class? She is drier than dreadnoughts, is she permanently? And infernally wet stiff surstiff, the first requisite of a gunplet form. Service as requisite. Thus the Caesars and their fortunes put out to sea with their subs, and their sadied engineers, and their long-suffering signalers. I do not even know the technical name of the sin, which causes a man to be born a destroyer signaler in this life, and the little yellow shells stuck all about where they can be easiest reached. The rest of their acts is written for the information of the proper authorities. It reads like a page of Todhunter. But the masters of merchant ships could tell more of eyeless shapes barely outlined on the foam of their own arrest, who shout orders through the thick gloom alongside. The strayed and anxious neutral knows them when their searchlights pin him across the deep, or their sirens answer the last yelp of his. As steam goes out of his torpedoed boilers, they stand by to catch and soothe him in his pajamas at the gangway, collect his scattered lifeboats, and see a warm drink into him. Before they turn to hunt the slayer, the 86 drifters punching and reeling up and down their 10-mile line of traps, the outer trawlers drawing the very teeth of death with water-sodden fingers, are grateful for their low-guarded signals. And when the Zeppelin's revealing starshell cracks darkness open above him, the answering crack of the invisible destroyer's guns comforts the busy mine layers. Big cruisers talk to them too, and what is more, they talk back to the cruisers. Sometimes they draw fire-pinkish spurts of light a long way off, where Fritz is trying to coax them over a minefield he has just laid, or they steal on Fritz in the midst of his job, and the horizon rings with barking which the inevitable neutral who saw it all reports as a heavy fleet action in the North Sea. The sea after dark can be as alive as the woods of summer nights. Everything is exactly where you don't expect it, and the shyest creatures are the farthest away from their holes. Things boom overhead like bitterns or scutter, alongside like hares, or arise dripping and hissing from below like otters. It is 87 the destroyer's business to find out what their business may be through all the long night, and to help or hinder accordingly. Dawn sees them pitch-poling insanely between headseas, or hanging on to bridges that sweep like scythes from one forlorn horizon to the other. A homeward-bound submarine chooses this hour to rise very ostentatiously, and signals by hand to a lieutenant in command. They were the same term at Dartmouth, and same first ship. What's he sayin'? Secure that gun. Well, you can't hear oneself speak. The gun is a bit noisy on its mountings, but that isn't the reason for the destroyer lieutenant's short temper. Says he's goin' down, sir. The signaler replies what the submarine had spelt out, and everybody knows it was cannot approve of this extremely frightful weather. Am going to by. Well, snaps the lieutenant to his signaler. What are you grinning at? The submarine has hung on to ask if the 88 destroyer will kiss her, and whisper good night. A breaking sea smacks her tower in the middle of the insult. She closes like an oyster, but just too late. Habit. There must be a quarter of a ton of water somewhere down below on its way to her ticklish batteries. What a wag, says the signaler dreamily. Well, he can't say he didn't get his little kiss. The lieutenant in command smiles. The sea is a beast, but a just beast. Racial untruths. This is trivial enough, but what would you have if admirals will not strike the proper attitudes, nor lieutenants emit the appropriate sentiments? One is forced back on the truth, which is that the men at the heart of the great matters in our empire are mostly of an even simplicity. From the advertising point of view, they are stupid, but the breed has always been stupid in this department. It may be due 89, as our enemies assert, to our racial snobbery, or as others hold to assert, Gogevan lack of imagination, which saves us from being overconcerned at the effects of our appearances on others. Either way, it deceives the enemy's people more than any calculated lie. When you come to think of it, though the English are the worst paperwork and viva voce liars in the world, they have been rigorously trained, since their early youth, to live and act lies for the comfort of the society in which they move, and so, for their own comfort. The result in this war is interesting. It is no lie that, at the present moment, we hold all the seas in the hollow of our hands. For that reason, we shuffle over them, shamefaced and apologetic, making arrangements here, and flagrant compromises there, in order to give substance to the lie that we have dropped fortuitously into this high seat, and are looking round the world for someone to resign it to. Nor is it any lie that, had we used the Navy's bare fist instead of its gloved hand, from the 90 beginning, we could, in all likelihood, have shortened the war. That being so, we elected to dab and peck at, and half strangle the enemy to let him go and choke him again. It is no lie that we continue on our inexplicable path. Animated, we will try to believe till other proof is given by a cloudy idea of alleviating or mitigating, something for somebody not ourselves here, of course, is where our racial snobbery comes in, which makes the German gibber. I cannot understand why he has not accused us to our allies of having secret commercial understandings with him. For that reason, we shall finish the German eagle, as the merciful lady killed the chicken. It took her the whole afternoon, and then you will remember the carcase had to be thrown away. Meantime, there is a large and unlovely water, inhabited by plain men in severe boats, who endure cold exposure, wet, and monotony, almost as heavy as their responsibilities charge them with heroism, but that needs heroism, indeed accuse them, 91 of patriotism. They become ribald examine into the records of the miraculous work they have done and are doing. They will assist you, but with perfect sincerity, they will make as light of the valor and forethought shown, as of the ends they have gained for mankind. The service takes all work for granted. It knew long ago that certain things would have to be done, and it did its best to be ready for them when it disappeared over the skyline. For maneuvers, it was practicing always practicing, trying its men and stuff, and throwing out what could not take the strain. That is why when war came, only a few names had to be changed, and those chiefly for the sake of the body, not of the spirit, and the seniors who hold the key to our plans, and know what will be done if things happen, and what lines wear thin in the many chains. They are of one fiber and speech with the juniors and the lower deck, and all the rest who come out of the undemonstrative households ashore. Here is the situation as it exists now. Say the seniors, this 92 is what we do to meet it. Look and count and measure and judge for yourself, and then you will know. It is a safe offer. The civilian only sees that the sea is a vast place divided between wisdom and chance. He only knows that the uttermost oceans have been swept clear, and the trade routes purged one by one, even as our armies were being convoyed along them, that there was no island nor key left unsearched on any waters that might hide an enemy's craft between the Arctic Circle and the Horn. He only knows that less than a day's run to the eastward of where he stands the enemy's fleets have been held for a year and 4 months, in order that civilization may go about its business on all our waters. Tales of the trade. The trade. They bear in place of classic names letters and numbers on their skin. They play their grisly blindfold games in little boxes made of tin. Sometimes they stalk the Zeppelin. Sometimes they learn where mines are laid, or where the Baltic ice is thin. That is the custom of the trade. Few prize courts sit upon their claims. They seldom tow their targets in. They follow certain secret aims, down under far from strife or din. When they are ready to begin, no flag is flown, no fuss is made, more than the shearing of a pin. That is the custom of the trade. The scouts' quadruple funnel flames, a mark from Sweden to the Swin. The cruiser's thunderous screw proclaims her comings out and goings in, but only whiffs of paraffin, or creamy rings that fizz and fade, show where the one-eyed death has been. That is the custom of the trade. Their feats, their fortunes, and their fames are hidden from their nearest kin. No eager public backs or blames. No journal prints the yarns they spin. The censor would not let it in. When they return from run or raid, unheard they work, unseen they win. That is the custom of the trade. And some work in the Baltic. No one knows how the title of the trade came to be applied to the submarine service. Some say that the cruisers invented it because they pretend that submarine officers look like unwashed chauffeurs. Others think it sprang forth by itself, which means that it was coined by the lower deck, where they always have the proper names for things. Whatever the truth, the submarine service is now the trade. And if you ask them why, they will answer, what else could you call it? The trade's the trade, of course. It is a close corporation, yet it recruits its men and officers from every class that uses the sea and engines, as well as from 98 many classes that never expected to deal with either. It takes them, they disappear for a while and return, changed to their very souls, for the trade lives in a world without precedents of which no generation has had any previous experience. A world still being made and enlarged daily. It creates and settles its own problems as it goes along. And if it cannot help itself, no one else can. So the trade lives in the dark and thinks out inconceivable and impossible things, which it afterwards puts into practice. It keeps books too, as honest traders should. They are almost as bald as ledgers, and are written up hour by hour on a little sliding table that pulls out from beneath the commander's bunk. In due time, they go to my lords of the Admiralty, who presently circulate a few carefully watered extracts for the confidential information of the junior officers of the trade, that these may see what things are done, and how the juniors read but laugh they have heard the stories with all the flaming detail, and much of the language either from a 99 chief actor, while they perched deferentially on the edge of a messroom fender, or from his subordinate, in which case they were not so deferential, or from some returned member of the crew, present on the occasion, who between half-shut teeth at the wheel jerks out what really happened. There is very little going on in the trade that the trade does not know within a reasonable time, but the outside world must wait until my lords of the Admiralty release the records. Some of them have been released now. Submarine and icebreaker. Let us take almost at random an episode in the life of Atroman 1000 submarine E9. It is true that she was commanded by Commander Max Horton, but the utter impersonality of the tale makes it as though the boat herself spoke, also never having met or seen any of the gentlemen concerned in the matter. The writer can be impersonal too. Some time ago, E9 100 was in the Baltic in the deeps of winter, where she used to be taken to her hunting grounds by an icebreaker. Obviously, a submarine cannot use her sensitive nose to smash heavy ice, with so the broad-beamed pushing chaperone comes along to see her clear of the thick harbor and shore ice in the open sea. Apparently, she is left to her own devices in company of the icebreaker. Then E9 proceeded. Neither in the senior nor the junior service does anyone officially go anywhere to assert position. Here it is not stated in the book, but the trade knows every aching single detail of what is left out. She spent a certain time in testing arrangements and apparatus, which may or may not work properly, when immersed in a mixture of blockus and dirty ice cream in a temperature well towards zero. This is a pleasant job made the more delightful by the knowledge that if you slip off the superstructure, the deadly Baltic chill will stop your heart long before even your heavy clothes can drown you. 101 hence. And this is not in the book either. The remark of the highly trained sailorman in these latitudes, who on being told by his superior officer, in the execution of his duty to go to hell, did insubordinately and enviously reply, "Do you think it'd be here?" If I could, whereby he caused the entire personnel, beginning with the commander, to say Amen, or words to that effect. E9 evidently made things work. Next day she reports, as circumstances were favorable, decided to attempt to bag a destroyer. Her cert position must have been near a Wellus destroyer run, for shortly afterwards she sees three of them, but too far off to attack, and later, as the light is failing, a fourth destroyer towards which she maneuvers keeping, she notes, very difficult owing to heavy swell. An observation balloon on a gusty day is almost as stable as a submarine pumping in a heavy swell, and since the Baltic is shallow, the submarine runs the chance of being let down with a whack on the bottom. None the less E9 works 102 her way to within 600 yards of the quarry, fires, and waits just long enough to be sure that her torpedo is running straight and that the destroyer is holding her course. Then she dips to avoid detection. The rest is deadly simple. At the correct moment, after firing 45 to 50 seconds, heard the unmistakable noise of torpedo detonating. 4 minutes later, she rose and found destroyer had disappeared. Then, for reasons probably connected with other destroyers, who too may have heard that unmistakable sound, she goes to bed below in the chill dark, till it is time to turn homewards. When she rose, she met storm from the north, and logged it accordingly. Spray froze as it struck, and bridge became a mass of ice. Experienced considerable difficulty in keeping the connector hatch free from ice. Found it necessary to keep a man continuously employed on this work. Bridge screen, immovable, ice 6 inches thick on it. Telegraphs frozen. In this state she forges ahead till midnight, and anyone who pleases can imagine the 103 thoughts of the continuous employee scraping and hammering round the hatch, as well as the delight of his friends below, when the ice slush spattered down the connector at last. She considered it advisable to free the boat of ice, so went below. As requisite. In the senior service, the two words "as requisite" cover everything that need not be talked about. E9 next day proceeded as requisite through a series of snowstorms and recurring deposits of ice on the bridge, till she got in touch with her friend the icebreaker, and in her company plowed and rooted her way back to the work. We know there is nothing to show that it was a near thing for E9, but somehow one has the idea that the icebreaker did not arrive any too soon for E9's comfort and progress. But what happens in the Baltic when the icebreaker does not arrive? That was in winter. In summer, quite the other way. E9 had to go to bed by 104 day, very often under the long glusting northern light, when the Baltic is as smooth as a carpet, and one cannot get within a mile and a half of anything with eyes in its head, without being put down. There was one time when E9, evidently on information received, took up a certain position, and reported the sea glassy she had to suffer in silence, while 3 heavily laden German ships went by for an attack. Would have given away her position. Her reward came next day, when she cited the words run like Marriott's enemy squadron, coming up fast from eastward proceeding inshore of us. They were 2 heavy battleships with an escort of destroyers, and E9 turned to attack. She does not say how she crept up in that smooth sea within a quarter of a mile of the leading ship, a 3-funnel ship of either the Deutschland or Braunschweig class, but she managed it and fired both bow torpedoes at her. No one torpedo was seen, and heard to strike her just before foremost funnel smoke and debris, appeared to go as high 105 as masthead, that much E9 saw before one of the Guardian destroyers ran at her. So says she. Observing her, I took my periscope off the battleship. This was excusable as the destroyer was coming up with intent to kill, and E9 had to flood her tanks and get down quickly even so the destroyer only just missed her, and she struck bottom in 43 feet. But says E9, who if she could not see kept her ears open at the correct interval, the 45 or 50 seconds mentioned in the previous case, the second torpedo was heard to explode, though not actually seen. E9 came up 20 minutes later to make sure the destroyer was waiting for her a couple of 100 yards away, and again, E9 dipped for the life, but just had time to see one large vessel approximately 4 or 5 miles away. Putting courage aside, think for a moment of the mere drill of it. All that last dive for that attack on the chosen battleship, the eye at the periscope, watching no one torpedo, get home the rush of the 106 vengeful destroyer, the instant orders for flooding, everything, the swift descent, which had to be arranged for with full knowledge of the shallow seafloors waiting below, and a guess at the course that might be taken by the seeking bows above, for assuming a destroyer to draw 10 feet, and a submarine on the bottom to stand 25 feet to the top of her connector. There is not much clearance in 43 feet salt water, especially if the boat jumps when she touches bottom, and through all these and half a hundred other simultaneous considerations, imagine the trained minds below counting, as only torpedomen can count, the run of the merciless seconds that should tell when that second shot arrived, then at the correct interval, as laid down in the table of distances, the boom and the jar of no two torpedo, the relief, the exhaled breath and untightened lips, the impatient waiting for a second peep. And when that had been taken, and the eye at the periscope had reported one little nigger boy in place of 2, on the waters perhaps cigarettes Roman 100, while 107, the destroyer sickled about at a venture overhead. Certainly, they give men rewards for doing such things, but what reward can there be in any gift of kings or peoples to match the enduring satisfaction of having done them not alone, but with and through and by trusty and proven companions? Defeated by darkness. E1 also a Baltic boat. Her commander FN Lawrence had her experiences too. She went out one summer day, and latitude Latin, the evening sighted 3 transports. The first she hit, while she was arranging for the second. The third inconsiderately tried to ram her before her sights were on, so it was necessary to go down at once and waste whole minutes of the precious scanting light. When she rose, the stricken ship was sinking, and shortly afterwards blew up. The other 2 were patrolling nearby. It would have been a fair chance in daylight, but the 108 darkness defeated her, and she had to give up the attack. It was E1 who during thick weather came across a squadron of battle cruisers and got in on a flanking ship, probably the Molk. The destroyers were very much on the alert, and she had to dive at once to avoid one who only missed her by a few feet. Then the fog shut down and stopped further developments. Thus do time and chance come to every man. The trade has many stories too of watching patrols, when a boat must see chance after chance go by under her nose, and merely write what she has seen naturally. They do not appear in any accessible records, nor, which is a pity, do the authorities release the records of glorious failures, when everything goes wrong, when torpedoes break surface and squatter like ducks, or arrive full square with a clang and burst of white water, and fail to explode when the devil is in charge of all the motors and clutches develop play that would scare a shoregoing mechanic 109 bald, when batteries begin to give off death, instead of power, and atop of all ice or wreckage of the strewn seas racks, and wrenches the hull, till the whole leaking bag of tricks limps home on 6 missing cylinders, and 1 ditto propeller, plus the indomitable will of the red-eyed husky scarecrows in charge. There might be worse things in this world for decent people to read than such records. Roman 2. Business in the Sea of Marmara. This war is like an iceberg. We the public only see an eighth of it above water, the rest is out of sight. And as with the berg, one guesses its extent by great blocks that break off and shoot up to the surface from some underlying outrunning spur a quarter of a mile away. So with this war sudden tales come to light, which reveal unsuspected activities in unexpected quarters. One takes it for granted such things are always going on somewhere, but the actual emergence of the record is always astonishing. Once upon a time, there were certain E-type boats who worked the Sea of Marmara 112. With thoroughness and humanity for the two in English hands are compatible, the road to their hunting grounds was strewn with peril, the waters they inhabited were full of eyes that gave them no rest, and what they lost or expended in wear and tear of the chase could not be made good till they had run the gauntlet to their base. Again, the full tale of their improvisations and maquitos will probably never come to light, though fragments can be picked up at intervals in the proper places. As the men concerned come and go, the Admiralty gives only the bones, but those are not so dry of the boat's official story. When Commander E. Courtney Boyle went to her work in the Sea of Marmara, she, like her sister, proceeded on her gayse engine up the Dardanelles, and a gayse engine by night between steep cliffs has been described by the lower deck as a full brass band in a railway cutting. So a fort picked her up with a searchlight and missed her with artillery. She dived under the minefield that guarded the straits and 113 when she rose at dawn in the narrowest part of the channel, which is about 1.5 miles across. All the forts fired at her. The water, too, was thick with steamboat patrols, out of which E selected a Turkish gunboat and gave her a torpedo. She had just time to see the great column of water shoot as high as the gunboat's mast when she had to dip again, as the men in a small steamboat were leaning over trying to catch hold of the top of my periscope. 6 hours of blind death. This sentence, which might have come out of a French exercise book, is all Lieutenant Commander Courtney Boyle sees fit to tell. And that officer will never understand why one taxpayer at least demands his arrest after the war, till he shall have given the full tale. Did he sight the shadowy underline of the small steamboat green through the deadlights, or did she suddenly swim into his vision from behind 114, and obscure without warning his periscope with a single brown clutching hand? Was she alone, or one of a mob of splashing, shouting small craft? He may well have been too busy to note, for there were patrols all around him, a minefield of curious design, an undefined area somewhere in front, and steam trawlers vigorously sweeping for him astern and ahead. And when he had burrowed and bumped and scraped through 6 hours of blind death, she found the Sea of Marmara crawling with craft, and was kept down almost continuously, and grew hot and stuffy in consequence, nor could she charge her batteries in peace. So, at the end of another hectic hunted day of starting them up and breaking off, and which is bad for the temper, decided to quit those infested waters near the coast and charge up somewhere off the traffic routes. This accomplished after a long hot run, which did the motors no good, she went back to her beat, where she picked up 3 destroyers convoying a couple of troopships 115, but it was a glassy calm, and the destroyers came for me. She got off a long-range torpedo at one transport, and ducked before she could judge results. She apologizes for this, on the grounds that one of her periscopes had been damaged, not, as one would expect by the gentleman, leaning out of the little steamboat, but by some casual shock caliber not specified day before, and so says, I could not risk my remaining one being bent. However, she heard a thud, and the dipped gorgeous those great clock hands on the white-faced circlus flicked, which is another sign of dreadful certainty. Down under when she rose again, she saw a destroyer convoying one burning transport to the nearest beach. That afternoon, she met a sister boat now gone to Valhalla, who told her that she was almost out of torpedoes, and they arranged a rendezvous for next day. But before we could communicate, we had to dive, and I did not see her again. There must be many such meetings in the trade, under all 116 skis boat rising, beside boat at the point agreed upon for interchange of news and materials. The talk shouted aloud with the speaker's eyes always on the horizon, and all hands standing by to dive even in the middle of a sentence. Annoying patrol ships. Kept to her job on the edge of the procession of traffic patrol vessels, annoyed her to such an extent that, as I had not seen any transports lately, I decided to sink a patrol ship, as they were always firing on me. So, she torpedoed a thing that looked like a mine layer, and must have been something of that kidney, for it sank, in less than a minute, a tramp steamer lumbering across the dead flat sea was thoughtfully headed back to Constantinople, by firing rifles ahead of her under fire. The whole day, observes philosophically the nature of her work, made this inevitable. She was all among the patrols, which kept her down a good deal, and made her draw on her batteries. And when she rose to charge watchers ashore, burned oil flares on the beach, or made smokes among the hills. According to the light in either case, there would be a general rush of patrolling craft of all kinds, from steam launches to gunboats. Nobody loves the trade, though did several things which made her popular. She let off a string of very surprised dows. They were empty in charge of a tug, which promptly fled back to Constantinople, stopped a couple of steamers full of refugees also bound for Constantinople, who were very pleased at being allowed to proceed instead of being Lusitania'd, as they had expected another refugee boat fleeing from goodness knows what horror. She chased into Rodosto harbor, where though she could not see any troops, they opened a heavy rifle fire on us, hitting the boat several times, so I went away and chased two more small tramps who returned towards Constantinople. Transports, of course, were fair game, and in spite of the necessity, she was under 118 of not risking her remaining, i.e., got a big one in a night of wind, and made another hurriedly beach itself, which then opened fire on her assisted by the local population returned fire, and proceeded says, the diversion of returning fire is one much appreciated by the lower deck, as furnishing a pleasant break in what otherwise might be a monotonous and odoriferous task. There is no drill laid down for this evolution, but etiquette and custom prescribe that on going up the hatch you shall not too energetically prod the next man ahead with the muzzle of your rifle likewise. When descending in quick time before the hatch closes, you are requested not to jump directly on the head of the next below, otherwise you act as requisite on your own initiative. When she had used up all her torpedoes, prepared to go home by the way she had come hither was no other and was chased towards Gallipoli by a mixed pack, composed of a gunboat, a torpedo-boat, and a tug. They shepherded me to Gallipoli, 119 one each side of me, and one astern, evidently expecting me to be caught by the nets there. She walked very delicately for the next 8 hours, or so, all down the straits, underrunning the strong tides, ducking down when the fire from the forts got too hot, verifying her position and the position of the minefield, but always taking notes of every ship in sight, till towards tea time she saw our navy off the entrance, and rose to the surface abeam of a French battleship, who gave us a rousing cheer. She had been away as nearly as possible 3 weeks, and a kind destroyer escorted her to the base, where we will leave her for the moment, while we consider the performance of Lieutenant Commander Roman 1000 Nasmyth in the same waters at about the same season. Proceeded in the usual way to the usual accompaniments of hostile destroyers up the straits, and meets the usual difficulties about charging up. When she gets through her wireless, naturally takes this opportunity to give trouble, and 120 is left deaf and dumb, somewhere in the middle of the Sea of Marmara, diving to avoid hostile destroyers in the intervals of trying to come at the fault in her aerial. Yet it is noteworthy that the language of the trade, though technical, is no more emphatic or incandescent than that of topside ships. Then she goes towards Constantinople, finds a Turkish torpedogan boat off the port, sinks her, has her periscope smashed by a 6-pounder, retires, fits a new top on the periscope. And at 10 a Roman 1000, they must have needed it pipes all hands to bathe. Much refreshed, she gets her wireless linked up at last, and is able to tell the authorities where she is and what she is after. Mr. Sila's Q swing. At this point it was off Rodestonter, a small steamer, which does not halt when requested, and so is fired at with several rounds from a rifle. The crew, on being told to abandon her, tumble into 121, their boats with such haste that they capsize 2 out of 3. Fortunately, says they are able to pick up everybody. You can imagine to yourself the confusion alongside the raffle of odds and ends floating out of the boats and the general party-colored harassonist all over the bright broken water. What you cannot imagine is this: an American gentleman then appeared on the upper deck, who informed us that his name was Silas Q. Swing of the Chicago Sun, and that he was pleased to make our acquaintance. He then informed us that the steamer was proceeding to Chanak, and he wasn't sure if there were any stores aboard. If anything could astonish the trade at this late date, one would almost fancy that the apparition of Silas Q. Swing, very happy to meet you gentlemen, might have started a rivet or two on E11's placid skin. But she never even quivered. She kept a lieutenant of the name of D. Oily. He was an expert in demolition parties, and he went aboard the tramp and reported 122 any quantity of Storsa 6-inch gun for instance lashed across the top of the forehatch. Silas Q. Swing must have been an unobservant journalist, a 6-inch gun mounting in the forehold pedestals for 12-pounders thrown in, as dunnage the afterhold full of 6-inch projectiles, and a scattering of other commodities. They put the demolition charge well in among the 6-inch stuff, and she took it all to the bottom in a few minutes after being touched off. Simultaneously with the sinking of the vessel, the goes on smoke was observed to the eastward. It was a steamer who had seen the explosion and was running for Rodosto. Chased her till she tied up to Rodosto Pier, and then torpedoed her, where she lay, a heavily laden storeship piled high with packing cases. The water was shallow here, and though bumped along the bottom, which does not make for steadiness of aim, She was forced to show a good deal of her only periscope, and had it dented but not 123 damaged by rifle fire from the beach as she moved out of Rodosto Bay. She saw a paddle boat loaded with barbed wire which stopped on the hail, but as we ranged alongside her attempted to ram us but failed owing to our superior speed. Then she ran for the beach very skillfully keeping her stern to E, till she drove ashore beneath some cliffs. The demolition squad were just getting to work, when a party of horsemen appeared on the cliffs above, and opened a hot fire on the conning tower E got out but owing to the shoal water it was some time before she could get under enough to fire a torpedo. The stern of a stranded paddle boat is no great target, and the thing exploded on the beach. Then she recharged batteries, and proceeded slowly on the surface towards Constantinople, all this between the ordinary office hours of 10 A Roman 1004 P Roman 1000. Her next day's work opens as no pallid writer of fiction dare begin thus having dived unobserved into Constantinople observed etc. Her observations were rather 124 hampered by cross-tides mud and currents, as well as the vagaries of one of her own torpedoes, which turned upside down and ran about. Promiscuously, it hit something at last, and so did another shot that she fired, but the waters by Constantinople Arsenal are not healthy to linger in. After one has scared up the whole seafront, so turned to go out matters were a little better below, and E in her perilous passage might have been a lady of the harem tied up in a sack and thrown into the Bosporus. She grounded heavily. She bounced up 30 feet, was headed down again, by a maneuver easier to shudder over than to describe, and when she came to rest on the bottom, found herself being swiveled right round the compass. They watched the compass with much interest. It was concluded, therefore, that the vessel E is one of the few who speaks of herself as a vessel, as well as a boat, was resting on the shoal under the Leander Tower, and was being turned round by the current, so they corrected her, started the motors, and bumped gently down into 125 feet of water, with no more knowledge than the lady in the sack, where the next bump would land them. The preening perch, and the following day was spent resting in the center of the Sea of Marmara. That was their favorite preening perch between operations, because it gave them a chance to tidy the boat and bathe, and they were a cleanly people both in their methods and their persons when they boarded a craft, and found nothing of consequence. They parted with many expressions of goodwill, and E had a good wash. She gives her reasons at length for going in and out of Constantinople. And the straits is all in the day's work, but going dirty you understand is serious. She had of late noticed the atmosphere in the boat becoming very oppressive, the reason doubtless being that there was a quantity of dirty linen aboard, and also the scarcity of fresh water necessitated a limit being placed on the frequency of personal washing, hence the 126 center of the Sea of Marmara, all hands playing overside, and as much laundry work as time. And the service allowed. One of the reasons, by the way, why we shall be good friends with the Turk again, is that he has many of our ideas about decency. In due time, E went back to her base. She had discovered a way of using unspent torpedoes twice over which surprised the enemy, and she had as nearly as possible been cut down by a ship which she thought was running away from her, instead of which she made the discovery at 3,000 yards. Both craft all out. The stranger steamed straight at her. The enemy then witnessed a somewhat spectacular dive at full speed from the surface to 20 feet. In as many seconds he then really did turn tail, and was seen no more going through the straits. She observed an empty troopship at anchor, but reserved her torpedoes in the hope of picking up some battleships. Lower down, not finding these in the narrows, she nosed her way back, and sank the trooper afterwards, continuing 127 journey down the straits off Kilid Bar. Something happened. She got out of trim, and had to be fully flooded before she could be brought to her required depth. It might have been whirlpools under water or other things. They tell a story of a boat which once went mad in these very waters, and for no reason ascertainable from within, plunged to depths that contractors do not allow for, rocketed up again like a swordfish, and would doubtless have so continued till she died had not something she had fouled dropped off and let her recover her composure. An hour later heard a noise similar to grounding, knowing this to be impossible in the water, in which the boat then was. I came up to 20 feet to investigate, and observed a large mine preceding the periscope at a distance of about 20 feet, which was apparently hung up by its moorings to the port hydroplane. Hydroplanes are the fins at bow and stern, which regulate a submarine's diving. A mine weighs anything from hundredweights to halftons. Sometimes it explodes if you merely think about 128 it at others. You can batter it like an empty sardine tin, and it submits meekly, but at no time is it meant to wear on a hydroplane. They dared not come up to unhitch it owing to the batteries ashore, So they pushed the dim shape ahead of them till they got outside come Kale. They then went full astern, and emptied the aftertanks which brought the bows down. And in this posture, rose to the surface when the rush of water from the screws together, with the sternway gathered, allowed the mine to fall clear of the vessel. Now a fool, said Dr. Johnson, would have tried to describe that. Romans 3. Ravages and repairs. Before we pick up the further adventures of H. Roman 1000 submarine E and her partner E here, is what you might call a cutting-out affair in the Sea of Marmara, which E Lieutenant Commander K. Roman 1000 Bruce put through quite on the old lines. E12's main motors gave trouble from the first, and she seems to have been a cripple for most of that trip. She sighted 2 small steamers, one towing 2, and the other 3 sailing vessels making 7 keels in all. She stopped the first steamer noticed. She carried a lot of stores, and moreover that her crew had no boats, were all on deck in lifebelts, not seeing any gun. E ran up alongside and told the first 130 lieutenant to board the steamer, then threw a bomb at E which struck, but luckily did not explode, and opened fire on the boarding party with rifles, and a concealed one in gun. E answered with her 6-pounder. And also with rifles the 2 sailing ships in tow very properly tried to foul E12's propellers, and also opened fire with rifles. It was as orientally mixed a fight as a man could wish. The first lieutenant and the boarding party engaged on the steamer E foul of the steamer, and being fouled by the sailing ships the 6-pounder, methodically perforating the steamer from bow to stern, the steamer's one in gun, and the rifles from the sailing ships raking everything, and everybody else. E12's coxswain on the conjunctor passing up ammunition, and E12's one workable motor developing slight defects at, of course, the moment when power to maneuver was vital. The account is almost as difficult to disentangle as the actual mess must have been. At any rate, the 6-pounder caused an 131 explosion in the steamer's ammunition, whereby the steamer sank in a quarter of an hour, giving time, and a hot time it must have been for E to get clear of her, and to sink the 2 sailing ships. She then chased the second steamer, who slipped her 3 tows, and ran for the shore. E knocked her about a good deal with gunfire. As she fled, saw her drive on the beach well alight, and then, since the beach opened fire with a gun at 1,500 yards, went away to re-anchor her motors, and write up her log. She approved of her first lieutenant's behavior under very trying circumstances. This probably refers to the explosion of the ammunition by the 6-pounder, which doubtless jarred the boarding party, and of the cox who acted as ammunition hoist, and of the gun's crew, who all did very well under rifle and small gun fire at a range of about 10 yards, but she never says what she really said about her motors. A brawl at a pier. Now we will take E on various work, either alone or as flagship of a squadron composed of herself and Lieutenant Commander Nasmith's boat. E hers was a busy midsummer, and she came to be intimate with all sort of craft, such as the 2-funneled gunboat off Sarkioi who fired at us, and missed as usual hospital ships going back and forth unmolested to Constantinople, the gunboat which fired at me on Sunday, and other old friends afloat and ashore. When the crew of the Turkish brigantine full of stores got into their boats by request, and then all stood up and cursed us, E did not lose her temper, even though it was too rough to lie alongside the abandoned ship. She told Acting Lieutenant R.W. Lawrence of the Royal Naval Reserve to swim off to her, which he did, and after a cursory search, who can be expected to Sherlock Holmes for hours with nothing on, set fire to her with the aid of her own matches and paraffin oil. There was nondescript craft of a few hundred tons who at a distance did not look very warlike, but when chased suddenly played a couple of 6-pounders, and got off 24 rounds at us. Before we were under, some of them were only about 20 yards off, and when a wily steamer, after sidling along the shore, lay up in front of a 134 town, she became indistinguishable from the houses, and so was safe because we do not low strafe open towns. Sailing dhows full of grain had to be destroyed at one rendezvous while waiting for E. E dealt with 3 such cases, and then towed the crews inshore and gave them biscuits, beef, and rum and water, as they were rather wet. Passenger steamers were allowed to proceed, because they were full of people of both sexes, which is an uncultured way of doing business. Here is another instance of our insular type of mind. An empty dhow is passed which E was going to leave alone, but it occurs to her that the boat looks rather deserted, and she fancies she sees 2 heads in the water, so she goes back half a mile, picks up a couple of badly exhausted men frightened out of their wits, gives them food and drink, and puts them aboard their property. Crews that jump overboard have to be picked up, even if, as happened in one case, there are 20 of 135 them, and one of them is a German bank manager taking a quantity of money to the Chanak Bank, Hospital ships are carefully looked over as they come and go, and are left to their own devices. But they are rather a nuisance because they force E and others to dive for them. When engaged in stalking warrantable game, there were a good many hospital ships, and as far as we can make out, they all played fair. E boarded one and reported everything satisfactory. Strange messmates. A layman cannot tell from the reports which of the duties demanded the most work, whether the continuous clearing out of transports, dhows, and sailing ships, generally found close to the well-gunned and attentive beach, or the equally continuous attacks on armed vessels of every kind. Whatever else might be going on, there was always the problem how to arrange for the crews of sunk ships. If a 136 dhow has no small boats, and you cannot find one handy, you have to take the crew aboard where they are horribly in the way, and add to the oppressiveness of the atmosphere. Like the 9 people, including 2 very old men, whom E made honorary members of her mess for several hours, till she could put them ashore after dark. Oddly enough, she could not get anything out of them. Imagine 9 bewildered Moslems, suddenly decanted into the reeking, clamorous bowels of a fabric obviously built by Shaitan himself, and surrounded by but our people are people of the book, and not doge-eating Kafirs, and I will wager a great deal that that little company went ashore in better heart and stomach than when they were passed down the Caningtor hatch. Then there were queer amphibious battles with troops who had to be shelled as they marched towards Gallipoli along the coast roads. E went out with E on this job early one morning, each boat taking her chosen section of landscape. Thrice 137 E rose to fire, thinking she saw the dust of feet, but each time it turned out to be bullocks. When the shelling was ended, I think the troops marching along that road must have been delayed, and a good many killed. The Turks got up a field gun in the course of the afternoon. Near true believer, never heard which outranged both boats, and they left accordingly. The next day she changed billets with E, who had the luck to pick up and put down a battleship close to Gallipoli. It turned out to be the Barbarossa. Meantime, E got a 5,000-ton supply ship, and later had to burn a sailing ship loaded with 200 bales of leaf and cut tobacco, Turkish tobacco. Small wonder that E came alongside that afternoon and remained for an hour, probably making cigarettes. Refitting under difficulties. Then he went back to her base. She had a hellish time among the Dardanelles. Nets was of course fired at by the forts. Just missed a torpedo from the beach, scraped a mine, and when she had time to take stock, found electric minewires twisted round her propellers and all her hull scraped and scored with wire marks. But that again was only in the day's work. The point she insisted upon was that she had been for 70 days in the Sea of Marmara, with no securer base for refit than the center of the same, and during all that while she had not had any engineer room defect which has not been put right by the engineer room staff of the boat. The commander and the 3rd officer went sick for a while. The 1st lieutenant got gastroenteritis and was in bed, if you could see that bed, for the remainder of our stay in the Sea of Marmara. But this boat has never been out of running order. The credit is ascribed to the excellence of my chief engineer room artificer, James Hollier, 139 Hague, on 227,715, whose name is duly submitted to the authorities for your consideration for advancement to the rank of warrant officer. 70 days of every conceivable sort of risk within and without in a boat which is all engineer room, except where she is sick bay. 12,000 miles covered since last overhaul, and never out of running. Order thanks to Mr. Hague. Such artists as he are the kind of engineer room artificers that commanders intrigue to get hold o fetch for his own boat, and when the tales are told in the trade, their names like Abu Ben Adhems lead all the rest. I do not know the exact line of demarcation between engineer room and gunnery repairs, but I imagine it is faint and fluidy. For example, while she was helping E to shell, a beached steamer smashed half her gun, mounting the gun layer being thrown overboard, and the gun nearly following him. However, the mischief was repaired in the next 24 hours, which, considering the very limited deck space of a 140 submarine, means that all hands must have been moderately busy. One hopes that they had not to dive often during the job. But worse is to come. E2 Commander Roman 500 stocks carried an externally mounted gun, which while she was diving up the Dardanelles on business got hung up in the wires and stays of a net. She saw them through the connector scuttles at a depth of 80 F-tone wire, hawser round the gun, another round the connector. And so on. There was a continuous crackling of small explosions overhead, which she thought were charges aimed at her by the guard boats who watched the nets. She considered her position for a while, backed, got up steam, barged ahead and shore through the whole affair in one wild surge. Imagine the roof of a navigable cottage, after it has snapped telegraph lines with its chimney, and you will get a small idea of what happens to the hull of a submarine when she uses her gun to break wire hawsers with. Trouble with a gun. E2 was a wet, strained, and uncomfortable boat for the rest of her cruise. She sank steamers, burned dhows, was worried by torpedo-boats, and hunted by Hun planes hit bottom freely, and frequently silenced forts that fired at her from lonely beaches, warned villages who might have joined in the game that they had better keep to farming, shelled railway lines and stations, would have shelled a pier, but found there was a hospital built at one end of it, so could not bombard, came upon dhows crowded with female refugees, which she allowed to proceed, and was presented with fowls in return. But through it all her chief preoccupation was that racked and strained gun and mounting. When there was nothing else doing, she reports sourly that she worked on gun. As a philosopher of the lower deck put it, "'Tisn't what you blanky do that matters, it's what you blanky have to do." In other words, worry not, work kills. Here for the moment the records end. I 143 have been at some pains not to pick and choose among them, so far from doctoring or heightening any of the incidents. I have rather understated them. But I hope I have made it clear that through all the haste and fury of these multiplied actions, when life and death and destruction turned on the twitch of a finger, not one life of any non-combatant was wittingly taken. They were carefully picked up or picked out, taken below, transferred to boats, and dispatched or personally conducted in the intervals of business to the safe unexploding beach. Sometimes they part from their chaperones with many expressions of goodwill, at others they seem greatly relieved and rather surprised at not being knocked on the head after the custom of their allies. But the boats with 100 things on their minds no more take credit for their humanity than their commanders explain the feats for which they won their respective decorations. Destroyers at Jutland. Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim. Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide. Nor any tide. Except he didn't shame his kind. Not even with that wind blowing and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more. This tide. And every tide. Because he was the son you bore. And gave to that wind blowing and that tide. And I. Stories of the battle. Cripple and paralytic. There was much destroyer work in the Battle of Jutland. The actual battlefield may not have been more than 20,000 square miles, but the incidental patrols from first to last must have covered many times that area. Doubtless, the next generation will comb out every detail of it. All we need remember is there were many squadrons of battleships and cruisers engaged over the face of the North Sea, and that they were accompanied in their dread comings and goings by multitudes of destroyers who attacked the enemy both by day and by night from the afternoon of May 31 to the morning of June 1, 1916. 150. We are too close to the gigantic canvas to take in the meaning of the picture. Our children, stepping backward through the years, may get the true perspective and proportions. To recapitulate what everyone knows. The German fleet came out of its North Sea ports scouting ships ahead, then destroyers, cruisers, battlecruisers, and last the main battle fleet in the rear. It moved north parallel with the coast of stolen Schleswig-Holstein and Jutland. Our fleets were already out. The main battle fleet Admiral Jellicoe, sweeping down from the north, and our battle cruiser fleet Admiral Beatty, feeling for the enemy. Our scouts came in contact with the enemy on the afternoon of May 30, about 100 miles off the Jutland coast. Steering northwest, they satisfied themselves he was in strength, and reported accordingly to our battlecruiser fleet, which engaged the enemy's battlecruisers at about 3:30. The enemy steered southeast to rejoin their own fleet, which was coming up from that 151 quarter. We fought him on a parallel course, as he ran for more than an hour. Then his battle fleet came in sight, and Beatty's fleet went about and steered northwest in order to retire on our battle fleet, which was hurrying down from the north. We returned fighting very much over the same waters, as we had used in our slant south. The enemy up till now had lain to the eastward of us, whereby he had the advantage in that thick weather of seeing our hulls clear against the afternoon light, while he himself worked in the mists. We then steered a little to the northwest, bearing him off towards the east, till at 6 o'clock Beatty had headed the enemy's leading ships, and our main battle fleet came in sight from the north. The enemy broke back in a loop, first eastward, then south, then southwest, as our fleet edged him off from the land, and our main battle fleet coming up behind them, followed in their wake. Thus for a while we had the enemy to westward of us, where he made a better mark. But the day was closing, and the weather thickened 152, and the enemy wanted to get away at 8:15. The enemy, still heading southwest, was covered by his destroyers in a great screen of gray smoke, and he got away. Night and morning. As darkness fell, our fleets lay between the enemy and his home ports during the night, our heavy ships keeping well clear of possible minefields, swept down south to south and west of the Horn's Reef, so that they might pick him up in the morning. When morning came, our main fleet could find no trace of the enemy to the southward, but our destroyer flotillas further north had been very busy with enemy ships apparently running for the Horn's Reef channel. It looks then as if when we lost sight of the enemy in the smoke screen and the darkness, he had changed course and broken for home astern our main fleets, and whether that was a sound maneuver or otherwise, he and the still flows of the North Sea alone can tell. 3 destroyers. A little time after the action began to heat up between our battle cruisers and the enemy's, 8 or 10 of our destroyers opened the ball for their branch of the service by breaking up the attack of an enemy light cruiser, and 15 destroyers of these they accounted for at least 2 destroyers. Some think more and drove the others back on their battle cruisers. This scattered that fight a good deal over the sea. 3 of our destroyers held on for the enemy's battle fleet, who came down on them at ranges, which eventually grew less than 3,000 yards. Our people ought to have been lifted off the seas bodily, but they managed to fire a couple 155 of torpedoes apiece. While the range was diminishing, they had no illusions, says one of the 3 speaking of her second shot, which she loosed at fairly close range. This torpedo was fired because it was considered very unlikely that the ship would escape disablement before another opportunity offered, but still they lived 3 destroyers against all a battle cruiser fleet's quickfirers, as well as the fire of a batch of enemy destroyers at 600 yards, and they were thankful for small mercies. The position being favorable, a 3rd torpedo was fired from each while they yet floated. At 2,500 yards, one destroyer was hit somewhere in the vitals and swerved badly across her next astern, who was obliged to alter course to avoid a collision, thereby failing to fire a 4th torpedo. Then that next astern observed signal for destroyer's recall, and went back to report to her flotilla captain alone of her 2 companions. One was badly hit and remained stopped. Between the lines, the other remained stopped, but was afloat when last seen. 156 ships that remain stopped are liable to be rammed or sunk by methodical gunfire. That was perhaps 50 minutes' work put in before there was any really vicious edge to the action, and it did not steady the nerves of the enemy battle cruisers any more than another attack made by another detachment of ours. What does one do when one passes a ship that remains stopped? I asked of a youth who had had experience. Nothing special, they cheer, and you cheer back. One doesn't think about it till afterwards. You see, it may be your luck in another minute. Luck? There were many other torpedo attacks in all parts of the battle that misty afternoon, including a quaint episode of an enemy light cruiser, who looked as if she were trying to torpedo one of our battle cruisers. While the latter was particularly engaged, a destroyer of ours, returning 157 from a special job, which required delicacy, was picking her way back at 30 knots through batches of enemy battle cruisers and light cruisers with the idea of attaching herself to the nearest destroyer flotilla and making herself useful. It occurred to her that, as she was in a most advantageous position for repelling enemies' destroyers, endeavoring to attack, she could not do better than to remain on the engaged bow of our battle cruiser. So she remained and considered things. There was an enemy battle cruiser squadron in the offing with several enemy light cruisers ahead of that squadron, and the weather was thickish and deceptive. She sighted the enemy light cruiser class uncertain, only a few thousand yards away, and decided to attack her in order to frustrate her, firing torpedoes at our battle fleet. This, in case the authorities should think that light cruiser wished to buy rubber. So she fell upon the light cruiser with every gun she had at between 2 and 4,000 yards, and secured a 158 number of hits, just the same as at target practice. While thus occupied, she sighted out of the mist a squadron of enemy battle cruisers that had worried her earlier in the afternoon, leaving the light cruiser. She closed to what she considered a reasonable distance of the newcomers, and let them have, as she thought, both her torpedoes. She possessed an acting sub-lieutenant, who, though officers of that rank think otherwise, is not very far removed from an ordinary midshipman of the type one sees in tow of relatives at the Army and Navy stores. He sat astride one of the tubes to make quite sure things were in order and fired when the sights came on. But at that very moment, a big shell hit the destroyer on the side, and there was a tremendous escape of steam believing since she had seen one torpedo leave the tube before the smash came believing that both her tubes had been fired, the destroyer turned away at greatly reduced speed, the shell reduced it, and passed quite reasonably close the light cruiser 159 whom she had been hammering so faithfully, till the larger game appeared meantime. The sub-lieutenant was exploring what damage had been done by the big shell. He discovered that only one of the two torpedoes had left the tubes, and observing enemy light cruiser beam on, and apparently temporarily stopped, he fired the providential remainder at her, and it hit her below the conning tower and well and truly exploded as was witnessed by the sub-lieutenant himself, the commander, a leading signalman, and several other ratings luck, continued to hold the acting sub-lieutenant further, reported that we still had 3 torpedoes left, and at the same time drew my attention to enemy's line of battleships. They rather looked as if they were coming down with intent to assault, so the sub-lieutenant fired the rest of the torpedoes, which at least started off correctly from the shell-shaken tubes, and must have crossed the enemy's line. When torpedoes turn up among a squadron, they upset the steering and distract the 160 attention of all concerned. Then the destroyer judged it time to take stock of her injuries, among other minor defects. She could neither steam steer nor signal. Towing under difficulties. Mark how virtue is rewarded. Another of our destroyers an hour, or so, previously had been knocked clean out of action, before she had done anything by a big shell which gutted a boiler room, and started an oil fire that is the drawback to oil. She crawled out between the battleships till she reached an area of comparative calm and repaired damage. She says the fire having been dealt with it was found. A mat kept the stokehold dry, my only trouble now being lack of speed. I looked round for useful employment, and saw a destroyer in great difficulties, so closed her. That destroyer was our paralytic friend of the intermittent torpedotubes, and a grateful ship she was when her crippled sister, but still good for a few knots, offered her a 161 tow under very trying conditions with large enemy ships approaching, so the two set off together, cripple and paralytic, with heavy shells falling round them, as sociable as a couple of lame hounds. Cripple worked up to 12 knots, and the weather grew vile, and the tow parted. Paralytic by this time had raised steam in a boiler or two, and made shift to get along slowly on her own, cripple hurpling beside her, till paralytic could not make any more headway in that rising sea, and cripple had to tow her once more. The tow parted, so they tied paralytic up rudely and effectively with a cable round her after bollards and gun, presumably because of strained forward bulkheads, and hauled her stern first through heavy seas at continually reduced speeds, doubtful of their position, unable to sound because of the seas, and much pestered by a wind which backed without warning, till at last they made land and turned into the hospital appointed for brave wounded ships. Everybody speaks well of cripple. Her name crops 162 up in several reports, with such compliments as the men of the sea use when they see good work. She herself speaks well of her lieutenant, who as executive officer took charge of the fire and towing arrangements in a very creditable manner, and also of Tom Badeye and Thomas Care, engineer room artificer, and stoker petty officer, who were in the stokehold at the time of the shell striking and performed cool and prompt decisive action, although both suffering from shock and slight injuries. Useful employment. Have you ever noticed that men who do Homeric deeds often describe them in Homeric language? The sentence "I looked round for useful employment" is worthy of Ulysses, when there was an evil sound at the ships of men who perished, and of the ships themselves broken at the same time. Roughly, very roughly speaking, our destroyers enjoyed 3 phases of prompt 163 decisive action. First, a period of daylight attacks, from 4 to 6 p. Roman 1000, such as the one I have just described, while the battle was young, and the light fairly good on the afternoon of May 30, when the second towards dark, when the light had lessened, and the enemy were more uneasy, and I think in more scattered formation, the third when darkness had fallen, and the destroyers had been strung out astern with orders to help the enemy home, which they did all night as opportunity offered. One cannot say whether the day or the night work was the more desperate from private advices. The young gentlemen concerned seemed to have functioned with efficiency either way. As one of them said, after a bit, you see, we were all pretty much on our own, and you could really find out what your ship could do. I will tell you later of a piece of night work, not without merit. Roman 2. The night hunt. Ramming an enemy cruiser. As I said, we will confine ourselves to something quite sane and simple, which does not involve more than half a dozen different reports. When the German fleet ran for home on the night of May 31, it seems to have scattered, I believe, is the word for the evolution in a general sauve qui pute. While the devil, livelily represented by our destroyers, took the hindmost, our flotillas were strung out far and wide on this job. One man compared it to hounds hunting half a hundred separate foxes. I take the adventures of several couples, 166 of destroyers, who on the night of May 30, one were nosing along somewhere towards the Schleswig-Holstein coast, ready to chop any Hun stuff, coming back to Earth. By that particular road, the leader of one line was Gehenna, and the next two ships astern of her were Eblis and Shaitan in the order, given there were others, of course. But with the exception of one goblin, they don't come violently into this tale. There had been a good deal of promiscuous firing that evening, and actions were going on all round. Towards midnight, our destroyers were overtaken by several 3 and 4 funnel German ships. Cruisers they thought hurrying home. At this stage of the game, anybody, might have been anybody, pursuer or pursued. The Germans took no chances, but switched on their searchlights and opened fire on Gehenna. Her acting sub-lieutenant reports a salvo hit us forward. I opened fire with the afterguns. A shell then struck us in a steam pipe, and I could see nothing but steam, but both starboard torpedotubes were fired. A fugitive on fire. New or old, the enemy had done her best. She had completely demolished Eblis bridge and searchlight platform, brought down the mast, and the forefunnel ruined the whaler, and the dinghy split the forecastle open above water from the stem to the galley, which is abaft the bridge, and below water had opened it up from the stem to the second bulkhead. She had further ripped off Eblis skin plating for an amazing number of yards on one side of her, and had fired a couple of 170 large caliber shells into Eblis at point-blank range, narrowly missing her vitals. Even so, Eblis is as impartial as a prize court. She reports that the second shot, a trifle of 8 inches, may have been fired at a different time, or just after colliding, but the night was yet young, and just after getting clear of this cruiser, an enemy battle cruiser grazed past our stern at high speed, and again the judgmatic mind I think she must have intended to ram us. She was a large 3-funneled thing, her center funnel shot away, and lights were flickering under her forecastle, as if she was on fire forward. Fancy the vision of her hurtling out of the dark, red-lighted from within, and fleeing on like a man with his throat cut. As an interlude, all enemy cruisers that night were not keen on ramming. They wanted to get home. A man I know, who was on another part of the drive, saw a covey bolt through our destroyers, and had just settled himself for a shot at one of them, when the knight threw up a second bird coming down full speed on his other 171 beam. He had bare time to jink between the two, as they whizzed past. One switched on her searchlight, and fired a whole salvo at him point blank. The heavy stuff went between his funnels. She must have sighted along her own beam of light, which was about 1,000 yards. How did you feel? I asked. I was rather sick. It was my best chance all that night, and I had to miss it or be cut in two. What happened to the cruisers? Oh, they went on, and I heard them being attended to by some of our fellows. They didn't know what they were doing, or they couldn't have missed me sitting the way they. Roman 999. The confidential books. After all that, Eblis picked herself up and discovered that she was still alive with a dog's chance of getting to port. But she did not bank on it. That grand slam had wrecked the bridge, pinning the commander 172 under the wreckage. By the time he had extricated himself, he considered it advisable to throw overboard the steel chest and dispatch box of confidential and secret books. These are never allowed to fall into strange hands, and their proper disposal is the last step, but one in the ritual of the burial. Service of His Majesty's ships at sea. Gehenna afire, and sinking out somewhere in the dark, was going through it on her own account. This is her acting sub-lieutenant's report. The confidential books were got up. The first lieutenant gave the order, every man aft, and the confidential books were thrown overboard. The ship soon afterwards heeled over to starboard, and the bows went under. The first lieutenant gave the order, everybody for themselves. The ship sank in about a minute, the stern going straight up into the air. But it was not written in the book of fate that stripped and battered Eblis should die that night, as Gehenna died, after the burial of the books. It was found 173 that the several fires on her were manageable, that she was not making water aft of the damage, which meant 2/3 of her were more or less in commission, and best of all, that 3 boilers were usable, in spite of the cruiser's shells. So she shaped course and speed to make the least water, and the most progress towards land on the way back. The wind shifted 8 points without warning. It was this shift, if you remember, that so embarrassed cripple and paralytic on their homeward crawland. What with one thing and another, Eblis was unable to make port till the scandalously late hour of noon on June 2, the mutual ramming having occurred about 11 p. Roman 1000 on May 31, she says this time, without any legal reservation. Whatever, I cannot speak too highly of the courage, discipline, and devotion of the officers and ship's company. Her recommendations are a compendium of godly deeds, for the use of mariners. They cover pretty much all that man may be expected to do. There was, as their 174 always is, a first lieutenant, who, while his commander was being extricated from the bridge wreckage, took charge of affairs, and steered the ship first from the engineer room, or what remained of it, and later from aft, and otherwise maneuvered as requisite among doubtful bulkheads in his leisure. He improvised means of signaling. And if there be not one joyous story behind that smooth sentence, I am a. The art of improvising. They all improvised like the masters of craft. They were the chief engineer room artificer. After he had helped to put out fires, improvised stops to the gaps which were left by the carrying away of the forward funnel, and mast he got, and kept up steam to a much higher point than would have appeared at all possible. And when the sea rose, as it always does if you are in trouble, he improvised pumping and drainage arrangements, thus allowing the ship to steam at a good speed on the whole 175. There could not have been more than 40 feet of hole. The surgeon up probationer performed an amputation, single-handed in the wreckage by the bridge, and by his wonderful skill, resource, and unceasing care and devotion, undoubtedly saved the lives of the many seriously wounded men. That no horror might be lacking, there was a short circuit among the bridge wreckage. For a considerable time, the searchlight and wireless were tangled up together, and the electricity leaked into everything. There were also 3 wise men who saved the ship, whose names must not be forgotten. They were Chief Engineer Room Artificer Lee Stoker, Petty Officer Gardiner, and Stoker Elvins. When the funnel carried away, it was touch and go whether the foremost boiler would not explode. These 3 put on respirators, and kept the fans going till all fumes etc. were cleared away. To each man, you will observe his own particular hell, which he entered of his own particular initiative. But Gehenna went down, and those of her crew who remained hung onto the rafts that destroyers carry, till they were picked up about the dawn by Shaitan, third in the line, who at that hour was in no shape to give much help. Here is Shaitan's tale. She saw the unknown cruisers overtake the flotilla, saw their leader switch on searchlights, and open fire as she drew abreast of 177 Gehenna, and at once fired a torpedo at the third German ship. Shaitan could not see Eblis, her next ahead, for, as we know, Eblis, after firing her torpedoes, had hauled off to reload. When the enemy switched his searchlights off, Shaitan hauled out too. It is not wholesome for destroyers to keep on the same course within 1,000 yards of big enemy cruisers. She picked up a destroyer of another division, Goblin, who for the moment had not been caught by the enemy's searchlights, and had profited by this decent obscurity to fire a torpedo at the hindmost of the cruisers, almost as Shaitan took station behind Goblin. The latter was lighted up by a large ship, and heavily fired at the enemy fled, but she left Goblin out of control with a grisly list of casualties, and her helm jammed. Goblin swerved, returned, and swerved again. Shaitan astern tried to clear her, and the 2 fell aboard each other, Goblin's bows deep in Shaitan's forebridge. While they hung thus locked, an unknown destroyer rammed Shaitan, aft, cutting off 178 several feet of her stern, and leaving her rudder jammed hard over, as complete a mess as the personal devil himself could have devised, and all due to the merest accident of a few panicky salvos. Presently, the 2 ships worked clear in a smother of steam and oil, and went their several ways. Quite a while after she had parted from Shaitan, Goblin discovered several of Shaitan's people, some of them wounded on her own forecastle, where they had been pitched by the collision. Goblin, working her way homeward on such boilers as remained, carried on a 1-gun fight at a few cables' distance, with some enemy destroyers who, not knowing what state she was in, sheered off after a few rounds. Shaitan holed forward, and opened up aft, came across the survivors from Gehenna, clinging to their raft, and took them aboard. Then some of our destroyers were thick on the sea that nitried to tow her stern first, for Goblin had cut her up badly forward, but since Shaitan lacked any stern, and her rudder was jammed hard 179 across where the stern should have been, the hawsers parted, and after leave asked of lawful authority across all that waste of waters, they sank Shaitan by gunfire, having first taken all the proper steps about the confidential books. Yet Shaitan had had her little crumb of comfort ere the end, While she lay crippled, she saw quite close to her a German cruiser that was trailing homeward in the dawn gradually heel over and sink. This completes my version of the various accounts of the four destroyers directly concerned for a few hours on 1 minute section of one wing of our battle. Other ships witnessed other aspects of the agony and duly noted them as they went about their business. One of our battleships, for instance, made out by the glare of burning Gehenna that the supposed cruiser that Eblis torpedoed was a German battleship of a certain class. So Gehenna did not die in vain, and we may take it that the discovery did not unduly depress Eblis wounded in hospital. Asking for trouble, the rest of the flotilla that the four destroyers belonged to had their own adventures later, one of them chasing, or being chased, saw Goblin out of control, just before Goblin and Shaitan locked, and narrowly escaped adding herself to that triple collision. Another loosed a couple of torpedoes at the enemy ships who were attacking Gehenna, which perhaps accounts for the anxiety of the enemy to break away from that hornet's nest as soon as possible. Half a dozen or so of them ran into four German battleships, which they set about torpedoing at ranges varying from half a mile to a mile and a half. It was asking for trouble, and they got it, but they got in return at least one big ship, and the same observant battleship of ours, who identified Eblis Bird, reported 3 satisfactory explosions in half an hour, followed by a glare that lit up all the sky, one of the flotilla closing on what she thought was the smoke of a sister in difficulties found herself well 181 in among the 4 battleships. It was too late to get away, she says, so she attacked, fired. Her torpedo was caught up in the glare of a couple of searchlights and pounded to pieces in 5 minutes, not even her rafts being left. She went down with her colors flying, having fought to the last available gun. Another destroyer who had borne a hand in Gehenna's trouble had her try at the 4 battleships and got in a torpedo at 800 yards. She saw it explode, and the ship take a heavy list. Then I was chased, which is not surprising. She picked up a friend who could only do 20 knots. They sighted several Hun destroyers who fled from them, then dropped on to 4 Hun destroyers altogether, who made great parade of commencing action, but soon afterwards thought better of it and turned away. So you see, in that flotilla alone, there was every variety of fight, from the ordered attacks of squadrons under control to single ship affairs, every turn of which depended on the second's decision of the men. 182 concerned endurance to the hopeless end, bluff and cunning, reckless advance and red-hot flight, clear vision, and as much of blank bewilderment as the senior service permits its children to indulge in. That is not much when a destroyer who has been dodging enemy torpedoes and gunfire in the dark realizes, about midnight, that she is following a strange British flotilla. Having lost sight of my own, she decides to remain with them and shares their fortunes, and whatever language is going. If lost hounds could speak, when they cast up next day, after an unchecked night among the wildlife of the dark, they would talk much as our destroyers do. The doorkeepers of Zion. They do not always stand in helmet and whole armor, with halberds in their hand, but being sure of Zion and all her mysteries, they rest a while in Zion, sit down and smile in Zion, I even jest in Zion at their ease. The gatekeepers of Baal. They dare not sit or lean, but fume and fret and posture, and foam and curse between, for being bound to Baal, whose sacrifice is vain. Their rest is scant with Baal. They glare and pant for Baal. They mouth and rant for Baal in their pain. But we will go to Zion, by choice and not through dread, with these our present comrades, and those our present dead, and being free of Zion, in both her fellowships, sit down and sup in Zion, stand up and drink in Zion. Whatever cup in Zion is offered to our lips. Romans 3. The meaning of Jos. A young officer's letter. As one digs deeper into the records, one sees the various temperaments of men revealing themselves through all the formal wording. One commander may be an expert in torpedoric, whose first care is how and where his shots went, and whether, under all circumstances of pace, light, and angle, the best had been achieved. Destroyers do not carry unlimited stocks of torpedoes. It rests with commanders whether they shall spend with a free hand at first, or save for night work ahedrisk, a possible while he is yet afloat, or hang on coldly for a certainty. So in the old whaling days, did the harpooner bring up or back off his boat 186, till some shift of the great fish's bulk gave him sure opening at the deep-seated life. And then comes the question of private judgment. I thought so-and-so would happen, therefore I did thus, and thus things may or may not turn out as anticipated. But that is merely another of the million chances of the sea. Take a case in point. A flotilla of our destroyers sighted 6. There had been 8 the previous afternoon. German battleships of Kingly and Imperial, cast very early in the morning of the 1st June, and duly attacked. At first our people ran parallel to the enemy, then as far as one can make out headed them and swept round sharp to the left, firing torpedoes from their port or left-hand tubes between them. They hit a battleship which went up in flame and debris, but one of the flotilla had not turned with the rest. She had anticipated that the attack would be made on another quarter, and for certain technical reasons, she was not ready when she turned, and single-handed, rest of the flotilla having finished and gone 187, carried out 2 attacks on the 5 remaining battleships. She got one of them amidships, causing a terrific explosion and flame above the masthead, which signifies that the magazine has been touched off. She counted the battleships when the smoke had cleared, and there were but 4 of them. She herself was not hit, though shots fell close. She went her way, and seeing nothing of her sisters, picked up another flotilla, and stayed with it till the end. Do I make clear the maze of blind hazard and wary judgment in which our men of the sea must move? Saved by a smoke screen. Some of the original flotilla were chased and headed about by cruisers after their attack on the 6 battleships, and a single shell from battleship or cruiser reduced one of them to such a condition that she was brought home by her sub-lieutenant, and a midshipman, her captain, first lieutenant gunner, torpedo coxswain, and both 188 signalmen were either killed or wounded. The bridge with charts instruments and signaling gear when all torpedoes were expended. A gun was out of action, and the usual cordite fires developed. Luckily, the engines were workable. She escaped under cover of a smokescreen, which is an unbearably filthy outpouring of the densest smoke, made by increasing the proportion of oil to air in the furnace feed. It rolls forth from the funnels looking solid enough to sit upon spreads in a searchlight-proof pad of impenetrable beastliness, and in still weather hangs for hours, but it saved that ship. It is curious to note the subdued tone of a boy's report. When by some accident of slaughter, he is raised to command, there are certain formalities which every ship must comply with on entering certain ports. No full-striped commander would trouble to detail them any more than he would the aspect of his club porter. The young un puts it all down, as who should say, I rang the bell, wiped my feet on the mat, and asked if they were at home. He is most 189 careful of the port proprieties. And since he will be sub again tomorrow, and all his equals will tell him exactly how he ought to have handled her, he almost apologizes for the steps he took, deeds which ashore might be called cool or daring. The senior service does not gush. There are certain formulae appropriate to every occasion. One of our destroyers, who was knocked out early in the day and lay helpless, was cited by several of her companions. One of them reported her to the authorities, but being busy at the time said he did not think himself justified in hampering himself with a disabled ship. In the middle of an action, it was not as if she was sinking. Either she was only holed forward and aft with a bad hit in the engine room, and her steering gear knocked out in this posture. She cheered the passing ships, and set about repairing her hurts with good heart and a smiling countenance. She managed to get under some sort of way at midnight, and next day was taken in tow by a friend. She says officially 190. His assistance was invaluable, as I had no oil left and met heavy weather. What actually happened was much less formal. Fleet destroyers, as a rule, do not worry about navigation. They take their orders from the flagship, and range out and return on signal like sheepdogs, whose fixed point is their shepherd. Consequently, when they break loose on their own, they may fetch up rather doubtful of their whereabouts. This injured one Roman 999. After she had been so kindly taken in tow, she inquired of her friend, message captain, to captain, have you any notion where we are? The friend replied, I have not, but I will find out. So the friend waited on the sun with the necessary implements, which luckily had not been smashed, and in due time made our observed position at this hour is thus. And thus the tow irreverently is, it didn't know you were a navigator. The friend with hauteur, yes, it's rather a hobby of mine. The tow had no idea it was as bad as all that, but I am afraid I'll have to trust you. 191. This time go ahead, and be quick about it. They reached a port correctly enough. But to this hour, the tow, having studied with the friend at a place called Dartmouth, insists that it was pure joss. Concerning joss, and joss, which is luck, fortune, destiny, The irony of fate or nemesis is the greatest of all the battle gods that move on the waters, as I will show you later. Knowledge of gunnery and a delicate instinct for what is in the enemy's minds may enable a destroyer to thread her way, slowing, speeding, and twisting between the heavy salvos of opposing fleets. As the dank-smelling waterspouts rise and break, she judges where the next grove of them will sprout. If her judgment is correct, she may enter it in her report as a little feather in her cap. But it is Joss when the stray 12-inch shell, hurled by a giant at some giant 10 miles away, falls on her from heaven and wipes out her. And her 192 profound calculations. This was seen to happen to a Hun destroyer in mid-attack. While she was being laboriously dealt with by a 4-inch gun, something immense took her Anch was not. Joss it is too when the cruiser's 8-inch shot that should have raked out your innards from the forward boiler to the wardroom stove deflects miraculously like a twig dragged through deep water, and almost returning on its track skips off unbursten and leaves you reprieved by the breadth of a nail from 3 deaths in one later. A single splinter, no more, may cut your oil-supply pipes as dreadfully and completely as a broken windscreen. Collision cuts the surprised motorist's throat, then you must lie useless fighting oilfares, while the precious fuel gutters away, till you have to ask leave to escape. While there are yet a few tons left, one ship, who was once bled white by such a piece of Joss, suggested it would be better that oil pipes should be led along certain lines, which she sketched as if that would make any 193 difference to Joss when he wants to show what he can do. Our sea people who have worked with him for 1,000 wet-ish years have acquired something of Joss' large toleration and humor. He causes ships in thick weather or under strain to mistake friends for enemies. At such times, if your heart is full of highly organized hate, you strafe frightfully and efficiently till one of you perishes, and the survivor reports wonders which are duly wirelessed all over the world. But if you worship Joss, you reflect, you put 2 and 2 together in a casual, insular way, and arrive at sometimes. Both parties arrive at instinctive conclusions which avoid trouble. An affair in the North Sea. Witness this tale. It does not concern the Jutland fight, but another little affair which took place a while ago in the North Sea. It was understood that a certain type of cruiser of ours would not be taking 194 part in a certain show. Therefore, if anyone saw cruisers very like them, he might blaze at them with a clear conscience, for they would be Hun boats, and one of our destroyers thick, whether as usual speed the silhouettes of cruisers exactly like our own stealing across the haze, said the commander to his sub, with an inflection neither period exclamation nor interrogation mark can render. That is them, said the sub in precisely the same tone. That is them, sir, as my sub, said the commander. Your observation is strictly in accord with the traditions of the service. Now as man to man, what are they? Wheel, said the sub, since you put it that way. I am DD if id fire, and they didn't, and they were quite right. The destroyer had been off on another job, and Joss had jammed the latest wireless orders to her at the last moment. But Joss had also put it into the hearts of the boys to save themselves and others. I hold no brief for the Hun, but honestly 195, I think he has not lied as much about the Jutland fight as people believe, and that when he protests he sank a ship, he did very completely sink a ship. I am the more confirmed in this belief by a still small voice among the Jutland reports, musing aloud over an account of an unaccountable outlying brawl witnessed by one of our destroyers. The voice suggests that what the destroyer saw was one German ship being sunk by another. Amen. Our destroyers saw a good deal that night on the face of the waters. Some of them, who were working in areas of comparative calm, submit charts of their tangled courses, all studded with notes along the zigzag, something like this. 8 P Roman 1000 heard explosion to the NW. A neat arrowhead points that way half an inch farther along a short change of course. And the word hit explains the meaning of sighted enemy cruiser. Engaged with destroyers. Another twist follows. 9 P Roman 1000. Past wreckage. Engaged enemy destroyers. Port beam opposite courses. 196 a long straight line, without incident, then a tangle and picked up. Survivors sewn so a stretch over to some ship that they were transferred to a fresh departure. And another brush with single destroyer on parallel course hit. 0 A Roman 1000 past bows enemy cruiser, sticking up 0 joined flotilla for attack on battleship squadron. So it runs on little ship in a few short hours, passing through more wonders of peril, an accident than all the old fleets ever dreamed. A child's letter. In years to come, naval experts will collate all those diagrams and furiously argue over them. A lot of the destroyer work was inevitably as mixed as bombing down a trench, as the scuffle of a polo match, or as the hot heaving heart of a football scrum. It is difficult to realize when one considers the size of the sea that it is that very size and absence of boundary which helps the confusion to give an idea here, is a letter 197. It has been quoted before, I believe. But it is good enough to repeat many times from a 19-year-old child to his friend, aged 17, and minus one leg in a hospital. I am so awfully sorry you weren't in it. It was rather terrible, but a wonderful experience, and I wouldn't have missed it for anything. But by Jove, it isn't a thing one wants to make a habit of. I must say it is very different from what I expected. I expected to be excited, but was not a bit. It's hard to express what we did feel like. But you know the sort of feeling one has when one goes in to bat at cricket, and rather a lot depends upon your doing well, and you are waiting for the first ball. Well, it's very much the same as that. Do you know what I mean? A sort of tense, feeling, not quite knowing what to expect. One does not feel the slightest bit frightened, and the idea that there's a chance of you and your ship being scuppered does not enter one's head. There are too many other things to think about. Then they ordered us to attack, so we bustled off full bore, being navigator, also having control of all the guns. I was on the bridge all the time, and remained for 12 hours, without leaving it at all. When we got fairly close, I sighted a good-looking Hun destroyer, which I thought I'd like to strafe. You know, it's awful fun to know that you can blaze off at a real ship and do as much damage as you like. Well, id just got their range on the guns, and just fired one round when some more of our destroyers, coming from the opposite direction, got between us and the enemy and completely blanketed us. So we had to stop, which was rather rot. Shortly afterwards, they recalled us. So we bustled back again. How any destroyer got out of it is perfectly wonderful. Literally, there were hundreds of Prague shells falling all round us from a 15-inch to 4-inch. And you know what a big 199 splash, a 15-inch bursting in the water, does make? We got washed through by the spray. Just as we were getting back, a whole salvo of big shells fell just in front of us, and short of our big ships. The skipper and I did rapid calculations as to how long it would take them to reload, fire again, time of flight, etc. As we had to go right through the spot, we came to the conclusion that, as they were short a bit, they would probably go up a bit. And they didn't, but luckily they altered deflection, and the next fell right astern of us. Anyhow, we managed to come out of that row without the ship or a man on board being touched. What the big ships stand. It's extraordinary the amount of knocking about the big ships can stand. One saw them hit, and they seem to be one mass of flame and smoke. And you think they're gone, but when the smoke clears away, they are apparently none the worse and still 200 firing away. But to see a ship blow up is a terrible and wonderful sight, an enormous volume of flame and smoke almost 200 feet high, and great pieces of metal, etc., blown sky high. And then when the smoke clears, not a sign of the ship. We saw one other extraordinary sight. Of course, you know the North Sea is very shallow. We came across a Hun cruiser, absolutely on end, his stern on the bottom, and his bow sticking up about 30 feet in the water, and a little farther on a destroyer in precisely the same position. I couldn't be certain, but I rather think I saw your old ship crashing along and blazing away. But I expect you have heard from some of your pals. But the night was far and away the worst time of all. It was pitch dark, and of course absolutely no lights, and the firing seems so much more at night, as you could see the flashes lighting up the sky, and it seemed to make much more noise, and you could see ships on fire and blowing up. Of course, we showed absolutely no lights. One expected 201 to be surprised any moment, and eventually we suddenly found ourselves within 1,000 yards of 2 or 3 big Hun cruisers. They switched on their searchlights and started firing like nothing on earth. Then they put their searchlights on us, but for some extraordinary reason did not fire on us, as of course we were going full speed. We lost them in a moment, but I must say that I think everybody else thought that that was the end, but one does not feel afraid or panicky. I think I felt rather cooler then than at any other time. I asked lots of people afterwards what they felt like, and they all said the same thing. It all happens in a few seconds. One has time to think. But never in all my life have I been so thankful to see daylight, Agonand. I don't think I ever want to see another night like that. Teats. Such an awful strain. One does not notice it at the time, but it's the reaction afterwards. I never noticed I was tired till I got back to harbor, and then we all turned in 202 and absolutely slept like logs. We were 7 to 2 hours, with little or no sleep. The skipper was perfectly wonderful. He never left the bridge for a minute for 24 hours, and was on the bridge or in the chart house the whole time we were out. The chart house is an airy dog kennel that opens off the bridge, and I've never seen anybody so cool and unruffled. He stood there smoking his pipe, as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening. One quite forgot all about time. I was relieved at 4 a Roman 1000, and on looking at my watch found I had been up there nearly 12 hours, and then discovered I was rather hungry the skipper, and I had some cheese and biscuits, ham sandwiches, and water on the bridge, and then I went down and brewed some cocoa and ship's biscuit. Not in the thick of the fight, not in the press of the odds, do the heroes come to their height, or we know the demigods. That stands over till peace. We can only perceive. Men returned from the seas, very grateful for leaves. They grant us sudden days, snatched from their business of war. We are too close to appraise what manner of men they are, and whether their names go down with age-kept victories, or whether they battle and drown. Unreckoned is hid from our eyes. They are too near to be great, but our children shall understand when and how our fate was changed and by whose hand. Our children shall measure their worth. We are content to be blind, for we know that we walk on a newborn earth, with the saviors of mankind. Roman 4. The minds of men. How it is done. What mystery is there like the mystery of the other man's? Jobber, what world so cut off as that which he enters when he goes to it? The eminent surgeon is altogether such an one as ourselves, even till his hand falls on the knob of the theatre door. After that, in the silence among the ether fumes no man, except his acolytes, and they won't tell has ever seen his face, so with the unconsidered curate. Yet before the war he had more experience of the business and detail of death than any of the people who contemned him his face. Also as he stands his bedside watches that countenance, with which he shall justify himself to his 206, Macarnon, have ever looked upon even the ditcher, is a priest of mysteries, at the high moment, when he lays out in his mind his levels, and the fall of the water that he alone can draw off clearly, but catch any of these men 5 minutes after they have left their altars, and you will find the doors are shut. Chance sent me almost immediately, after the Jutland fight, a lieutenant of one of the destroyers engaged among other matters. I asked him if there was any particular noise. Well, I haven't been in the trenches, of course, he replied, but I don't think there could have been much more noise than there was. This bears out a report of a destroyer who could not be certain whether an enemy battleship had blown up or not, saying that, in that particular corner, it would have been impossible to identify anything less than the explosion of a whole magazine. It wasn't exactly noise, he reflected. 207 noise is what you take in from outside. This was inside you, it seemed to lift you right out of everything. And how did the light affect when I asked, trying to work out a theory that noise and light produced beyond known endurance form an unknown anesthetic and stimulant comparable to, but infinitely more potent than the soothing effect of the smoke pall of ancient battles. The lights were rather curious, was the answer. I don't know that one noticed searchlights particularly, unless they meant business. But when a lot of big guns loosed off together, the whole sea was lit up, and you could see our destroyers running about like cockroaches on a tin soup plate. Then is black the best color for our destroyers? Some commanders seem to think we ought to use gray. Blessed if I know, said young Dante, everything shows black in that light. Then it all goes out again, with a bang, trying for the eyes if you're spotting. Ship dogs. And how did the dogs take it? I pursued. There are several destroyers more or less owned by pet dogs, who start life as the chance-found property of a stoker, and end in supreme command of the bridge. Most of 'em didn't like it a bit. They went below one time, and wanted to be loved. They knew it wasn't ordinary practice. What did Arabella do? I had heard a good deal of Arabella. Oh, Arabella's quite different. Her job has always been to look after her master's pyjamas folded up at the head of the bunk, you know. She found out pretty soon the bridge was no place for a lady, so she hopped downstairs, and got in. You know how she makes 3 little jumps to it, first onto the chair, then on the flaptable, and then up on the pillow. When the show was over there she was as usual. Was she glad to see her master? Now Arabella is between 9 and 11.5 inches long. Does the Hun run to pets at all? I shouldn't say so. He's an unsympathetic fellow on the Hun, but he might cherish a dachshund, or so. We never picked up any ship's pets off him, and I am sure we should if there had been. That I believed as implicitly as the tale of a destroyer, attacked some months ago, the object of which was to flush Zeppelins. It succeeded, for the flotilla was attacked by several right in the middle of the flurry. A destroyer asked permission to stop, and lower dinghy to pick up ship's dog, which had fallen overboard. Permission was granted, and the dog was duly rescued. Lord knows what the Hun made of it, said my informant. He was rumbling round dropping bombs, and the dinghy was digging out for all she was worth. And the dog fiend was swimming for Dunkirk. It must have looked rather mad from above 210, but they saved the dog fiend, and then everybody swore he was a German spy in disguise. The fight, and about this Jutland fight, I hinted not for the first time. Oh, that was just a fight, there was more of it than any other fight, I suppose, but I expect all modern naval actions must be pretty much the same. But what does one do? How does one feel? I insisted, though I knew it was hopeless. One does one's job. Things are happening all the time. A man may be right under your nose. One, minute to serving a gun, or something, gan the next minute he isn't there. And one notices that at the time. Yes, but there's no time to keep on noticing it. You've got to carry on somehow or other, or your show stops. I tell you what one does notice, though, if one goes below for anything, or has to pass 211 through a flat somewhere, and one sees the old wardroom clock ticking, or a photograph pinned up, or anything of that sort, one notices that, oh yes, and there was another thing, the way a ship seemed to blow up. If you were far off her, you'd see a glare, then a blaze, and then the smoke malls high lifting quite slowly, then you'd get the row, and the jar of it just like bumping over submarines. Then a long while after, perhaps, you run through a regular rain of bits of burnt paper, coming down on the decks like showers of volcanic ash. You know, the door of the operating room seemed just about to open, but it shut again. And the Hun's gunnery. That was various sometimes. They began quite well and went to pieces after they'd been strafed a little. But sometimes they picked up again. There was one Hun boat that got no end of a hammering, and it seemed to do her gunnery good. She improved tremendously, till we sank her, I expect. Wed knocked out some scientific 212 Hun in the controls, and he'd been succeeded by a man who knew how. It used to be Fritz last year when they spoke of the enemy, now it is Hun, or as I have heard, Yahun, being a superlative of Yahoo in the Napoleonic Wars. We called the Frenchmen too many names for any one of them to endure, but this is the age of standardization. And what about our lower deck? I continued. They carried on, as usual. It takes a lot to impress the lower deck when they're busy, and he mentioned several little things that confirmed this. They had a great deal to do, and they did it serenely, because they had been trained to carry on under all conditions, without panicking. What they did in the way of running repairs was even more wonderful, if that be possible, than their normal routine. The lower deck nowadays is full of strange fish, with unlooked-for accomplishments, as in the recorded case of two simple 213 seamen of a destroyer, who, when need was sourced, came to the front as trained experts in first aid. And know what about the actual Hun losses at Jutland? I ventured. You've seen the list, haven't you? Yes, but it occurred to me that they might have been a shade underestimated, and I thought perhaps a perfectly plain asbestos fire curtain descended in front of the already locked door. It was none of his business to dispute the drive. If there were any discrepancies between estimate and results, one might be sure that the enemy knew about them, which was the chief thing that mattered. It was said he jossed that the light was so bad at the hour of the last roundup, when our main fleet had come down from the north, and shoveled the Hun round on his tracks. Per contra, had it been any other kind of weather, the odds were the Hun would not have ventured so far as it was. The Hun's fleet had come out, and 214 gone back again, none the better for air and exercise. We must be thankful for what we had managed to pick up. But talking of picking up, there was an instance of almost unparalleled joss which had stuck in his memory. A soldierman related to one of the officers, in one of our ships that was put down, had got 5 days' leave from the trenches, which he spent with his relative aboard, and thus dropped in for the whole performance. He had been employed in helping to spot, and had lived up a mast till the ship sank, when he stepped off into the water and swam about till he was fished out and put ashore. By that time, the tale goes, his engineer-roomdreed khaki had shrunk halfway up his legs and arms, in which costume he reported himself to the War Office, and pleaded for 1 little day's extension of leave to make himself decent. Not a bit of it, said the War Office. If you choose to spend your leave playing with sailormen and getting wet all over, that's your concern. You will return to duty by 215 tonight's boat. This may be a libel on the WO, but it sounds very like them. And he had to, said the boy, but I expect he spent the next week at headquarters telling fat generals all about the fight. And of course, the Admiralty gave you all lots of leave. Us, yes, heaps. We had nothing to do except clean down and oil up, and be ready to go to sea again in a few hours. That little fact was brought out at the end of almost every destroyer's report having returned to base at such. And such a time I took in oil etc. and reported ready for sea at Aucklock. When you think of the amount of work a ship needs, even after peace maneuvers, you can realize what has to be done on the heels of an action. And as there is nothing like housework. For the troubled soul of a woman, so a general cleanup is good for sailors. I had this from a petty officer, who had also passed through deep waters. If you've 216 seen, your best friend go from alongside you and your own officer, and your own boat's crew with him, and things of that kind. A man's best comfort is small variegated jobs, which he is damned for continuous. The silent navy. Presently my friend of the destroyer went back to his stark desolate life, where feelings do not count, and the fact of his being cold, wet, seasick, sleepless, or dog-tired had no bearing whatever on his business, which was to turn out at any hour in any weather, and do, or endure decently according to ritual what that hour and that weather demanded. It is hard to reach the kernel of navy minds, the unbribable seas and mechanisms they work on, and through have given them the simplicity of elements and machines, the habit of dealing with swift accident, a life of closest and strictest association with their own caste, as well as contact with 217 all kinds of men, all earth over, have added an immense cunning to those qualities, and that they are from early youth cut out of all feelings that may come between them and their ends, makes them more incomprehensible than Jesuits even to their own people. What then must they be to the enemy? Here is a service which prowls forth and achieves at the lowest something of a victory. How fairy-ching a one, only the war's end will reveal. It returns in gloomy silence, broken by the occasional hoot of the longshore loafer, after issuing a bulletin, which though it may enlighten the professional mind does not exhilarate the layman. Meantime, the enemy triumphs wirelessly far, and wide a few frigid and perfunctory-seeming contradictions are put forward against his resounding claims. A naval expert or two is heard, talking off. The rest is silence anon. The enemy, after a prodigious amount of explanation, which not even the neutrals seem to take any interest in, revises his claims, and very 218 modestly enlarges his losses. Still no sign. After weeks, there appears a document giving our version of the affair, which is as colorless, detached, and scrupulously impartial as the findings of a prize court. It opines that the list of enemy losses which it submits give the minimum in regard to numbers, though it is possibly not entirely accurate in regard to the particular class of vessel, especially those that were sunk during the night attacks. Here the matter rests and remains just like our blockade. There is an insolence about it all that makes one gasp. Yet that insolence springs naturally and unconsciously, as an oath out of the same spirit that caused the destroyer to pick up the dog, the reports themselves. And tenfold more the stories not in the reports are charged with it, but no words by any outsider can reproduce just that professional tone and touch a man writing home after the fight points out that the great consolation for not having cleaned up the enemy altogether was that, anyhow, those East 219 Coast Devils a fellow squadron, if you please, which up till Jutland had had most of the fighting, were not there. They missed that show. We were as cock-a-hoop as a girl who had been to a dance that her sister has missed. This was one of the figures in that dance. A little British destroyer, her midships rent by a great shell, meant for a battle cruiser, exuding steam from every pore, able to go ahead, but not to steer, unable to get out of anybody's way, likely to be rammed by any one of a dozen ships, her siren whimpering, "Let me through," make way, her crew fallen and aft, dressed in life belts, ready for her final plunge, and cheering wildly as it might have been an enthusiastic crowd when the king passes. Let us close on that note. We have been compassed about so long and so blindingly by wonders and miracles, so overwhelmed by revelations of the spirit of men in the basest and most high 220, that we have neither time to keep tally of these furious days, nor mind to discern upon which hour of them our world's fate hung. The neutral. Brethren, how shall it fare with me when the war is laid aside? If it be proven that I am he for whom a world has died, if it be proven that all my good, and the greater good I will make, were purchased me by a multitude, who suffered for my sake, that I was delivered by mere mankind, vowed to one sacrifice, and not as I hold them battle blind, but dying with opened eyes, that they did not ask me to draw the sword, when they stood to endure their lot, what they only looked to me for a word. And I answered I knew them not. If it be found when the battle clears, their death has set me free, Then how shall I live with myself through the years, which they have bought for me? Brethren, how must it fare with me? Or how am I justified, if it be proven that I am he, for whom mankind has died? If it be proven that I am he, who being questioned denied,